Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. If you listen long enough to the Earth, it starts to sound like water, the low pulse under everything, the same rhythm that once erased nearly all that lived, and yet somehow kept the memory of its own destruction alive. From mountain temples to coral-ringed islands, from myths carved in basalt to songs whispered by desert wind, nearly every culture remembers a time when the world drowned. It is one of the few stories that appears everywhere. Different languages, different gods, but the same silence afterward. Why? Why would minds separated by oceans invent the same fear? Perhaps because water never had to be invented. It is the oldest storyteller on the planet. Every flood, every tide, every seasonal rising of a river has the same vocabulary. Taking, giving, and leaving behind a thin film of memory. When the first people settled beside rivers, they were not only following food or fertile soil, they were taking a seat beside the most unpredictable force they knew. To live by water is to live with risk, and risk demands explanation. Long before physics or hydrology, there were stories. The Deluge was the most complete explanation of all, not a storm or a season, but a reset. The moment when life's order gives up and begins again. Archaeologists studying early settlements notice something subtle. The closer a culture lived to flooding rivers, the stronger its myths about cleansing and rebirth. The low plains of what would become Mesopotamia, the valley of the Nile, the flood basins of the Indus and the Yellow River, each one a stage where humanity learned to fear and to depend on water in the same breath. Sediment cores pulled from these regions show repeating layers of silt, some just the result of heavy rainfall, others catastrophic enough to bury entire horizons of habitation. People didn't need to imagine a flood that destroyed everything. They had seen it happen again and again. Yet the scale of the memory seems larger than experience. These weren't small local tragedies. They became world endings. One possibility is that myths exaggerate because memory does. A fisherman's story grows with the tide. But there's another pattern that scientists notice. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, meltwater from collapsing glaciers raised sea levels by more than 100 meters. Coastlines vanished. Whole ecosystems were swallowed in centuries, an instant on a geological clock, but long enough for generations to watch their homelands retreat into the sea. Oral histories from Aboriginal Australia, Polynesia, and the North Atlantic echo these changes. The ocean moved, villages moved, the world moved. When we hear stories of the Great Flood, we're also hearing the echo of that global rearrangement, the slow drowning of the prehistoric shore. Some researchers think this period left a psychological imprint deep enough to pass through cultures that never met. It wasn't one single event, but thousands of local disasters stitched into a universal memory. To explain it, humanity did what it always does. We made narrative from noise. We pictured a beginning so wet and violent that even the gods had to start over. Clay tablets, hieroglyphic hymns, and carved stones all preserve this idea, not just of water destroying, but of something being chosen to survive. The seed, the remnant, the witness. It's the same pattern that later religions would reuse. A test, a warning, and a promise. The flood becomes both punishment and protection. The science of this is easier to see than the emotion. We know that sudden environmental change leaves traces of migration, famine, and adaptation in the archaeological record. But in the human record, stories, it leaves the feeling of cosmic guilt. To ancient minds, catastrophe required reason. Either the world had misbehaved, or the sky had. Even modern geology still borrows the language of myth. We talk about extinction events, bottlenecks, collapses, resets. Every new layer of rock is a quiet archive of endings. The difference is that now we can measure them instead of worship them. Yet the humility is the same. Scientists reading layers of silt aren't so far from priests reading omens in the sky. Both are trying to learn what the planet was trying to say. What makes the flood unique among myths is that it refuses to stay confined to religion. It has become part of science's own imagination. The idea that life can be reset, that extinction can clear the slate, is written into evolutionary theory. Even the fossil record tells a story of many floods, of oxygen, of lava, of impact dust. Each one wiped something clean. Perhaps that's why the image survives. It feels honest about the universe's temperament. Still, there's another reason the flood endures. It comforts us. To think that destruction comes with a plan, that chaos ends with calm waters and a sunrise, is less terrifying than randomness. The flood narrative doesn't only warn. It reassures that survival is possible, that one small vessel, one fragment of order, will always remain afloat. When archaeologists uncover flood layers beneath ancient cities, they sometimes find new settlements built directly on top of the ruins. Humanity's oldest architectural tradition might be rebuilding. So far, we've never found a single event that could have wiped out the entire species at once. The Earth's record shows regional floods. Yes, sometimes massive, but not a global ocean swallowing all land. Yet the emotional scale of those local disasters would have felt absolute. If the horizon of your world was 20 kilometers wide, a week of unbroken rain could erase it completely. For the people watching their fields dissolve, that was the end of the world. And so the story begins there, the river rising without mercy, the familiar turn to sea. When linguists trace the oldest flood words across families of languages, they often find common roots describing both overflow and birth. It's the same metaphor, destruction giving way to creation. Even modern cosmology uses a similar rhythm, the Big Bang followed by cooling, expansion and new order. The flood in its simplest form is the universe inhaling and exhaling. There's a quiet humour in how consistent we are. Give humans any disaster, and we'll build a moral around it. A comet becomes divine punishment. A drought becomes a test of faith. A flood becomes a reset button. Perhaps that's the mind's way of shrinking the unthinkable down to a story we can sleep beside. And maybe that is the real reason every civilization tells this one. It isn't about water at all, but about fear given form. As scientists, we can dig and measure and model, but we're also part of the same species that once knelt beside swollen rivers, asking the same questions. The evidence tells us that flood shaped settlement patterns, trade routes, and the birth of cities. Without the anxiety of unpredictable water, there might have been no need to plan ahead, to store grain, to build walls, or to invent writing to count what the river took. In that sense, the flood didn't just destroy civilization, it created it. When you touch an ancient clay tablet, you're touching the very material that once carried those first attempts to outlast disaster. Clay hardens in fire and water, both forces that threaten life. Maybe that's why we chose it to preserve memory. We trusted the same elements that ruin us to remember us, and they did. Tonight, as you listen, somewhere the rain is beginning again, a sound older than speech, the planet rehearsing its favourite story. Scientists can tell us how floods happen, but not why they still matter so much. Perhaps the answer is simple. The flood myth isn't just history. It's autobiography. It's the mind describing what it feels like to be human on a restless world, always surrounded by the possibility of being washed away. And yet, we never are. Every culture that tells of a world destroyed also tells of a world rebuilt. The lesson, repeated quietly through clay, stone and scripture, is not that the waters came, but that something remembered how to float. All right. Whether you're in bed, driving, cooking, or just staring into the quiet of another sleepless night, tell me, where on earth are you listening from, and what time is it there? I'm always curious how far these old rivers can travel. If you stood on the plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates around 6,000 years before our time, you would see almost nothing but water and light. The horizon would shimmer with mirages, and the air would hang thick with insects, reeds, and heat. This was not yet the Mesopotamia we picture in textbooks, a land of walls, writing, and kings, but a restless delta where the rivers changed course, as if the ground itself were breathing. Every spring the snowmelt from Anatolia poured south, bursting the banks, drowning fields, and then leaving behind the rich, dark silt that would feed the first real cities of the world. For early farmers, this rhythm was both gift and threat. The same water that gave them life could, with one mistake in timing, erase their harvest and their homes. It is here, between these rivers, that something quietly revolutionary happened. Humanity began to record. not because we suddenly became more intelligent or more ambitious, but because survival required memory that outlived the body. When floods erase your landmarks, you need marks that can't be erased. The earliest signs of this memory were not words but impressions, small tokens of clay shaped like sheep, jars and grain. They were accounting stones, used to track trade, labour and tribute. Each one told a miniature story of obligation, who owed whom and what the river had taken or spared. Over time, people began pressing those tokens into flat pieces of clay, realizing that the imprint could stand for the object itself. In doing so, they invented the seed of writing. Archaeologists call these boule, and thousands have been found across the ancient floodplain. They look simple, but their logic is profound. To press a token into wet clay is to declare, I remember this. I want the earth itself to remember it with me. When the same clay was fired, accidentally in a hearth or deliberately in a kiln, the record hardened into permanence. Clay, the stuff left behind by floods, became the medium that resisted them. It's tempting to imagine some early scribe, tired of rebuilding, deciding that if the gods could wipe the slate clean, then so could he. Only his slate would be the riverbed itself. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia was unstable in ways that are hard for us to imagine today. The rivers meandered wildly, sometimes shifting their main channels by many kilometres in a single century. Satellite imagery shows the ghost lines of ancient watercourses, looping and fading like the memory of veins beneath skin. Cities rose and fell with these migrations. When the river abandoned them, their wells dried and their fields turned to salt. The people who stayed behind would tell their children that the gods had withdrawn favour. The ones who moved built new temples closer to the living water and began to record more carefully the signs of its mood. Flood height, grain yield, rainfall, all became sacred data. The first temples, called ziggurats in later eras, were built as both spiritual and hydrological devices. They lifted offerings above the danger line, symbolically and literally keeping them dry. Priests tracked celestial patterns and river levels, correlating the heavens with the flood's arrival. In a sense, the earliest scientists were weathermen praying for predictable chaos. Their prayers were calculations. Their calculations became calendars, and those calendars inscribed in clay became the first archives of time. It is strange to think that civilization began not in stability, but in reaction to volatility. We often imagine progress as a straight line from order to complexity, but here it seems to have been the opposite. The unpredictability of nature forced minds to organize, to measure, to imagine systems of cause and consequence. In trying to appease the rivers, humans invented bureaucracy, mathematics, and eventually myth. The floodplain was the world's first laboratory for the study of uncertainty. By around 4,000 years before our era, permanent settlements such as Eridu and Uruk had appeared, each surrounded by networks of irrigation canals carved by hand. To keep those canals functional required coordination on a scale no small tribe could manage. Someone had to remember which field belonged to which family, how much barley was stored, and when the dikes needed reinforcement. Memory became a civic duty. The tablets found in these early cities list rations for workers and offerings to deities, but beneath those ledgers lies the same logic as the old clay tokens: to record is to survive. What fascinates modern historians is how intimately this practical record-keeping merged with spiritual thought. When the floods came early, it meant the gods were angry. When they came late, the gods were testing patience. Over generations, the act of writing itself took on divine significance. The Sumerian word for scribe, dabsar, literally means tablet writer, but it also implied sacred authority. The scribe was not only a bureaucrat, he was a mediator between human forgetfulness and divine permanence. To understand the mindset of those first recorders, we can look to their environment. The Tigris, swift and violent, carried the energy of the northern mountains. The Euphrates, broader and slower, flowed from the west through fertile plains. Where they met, they created a geography of extremes, mudflats that could turn from desert to swamp overnight. When you live in a place that's fickle, precision becomes an act of faith. Every grain counted, every mark in clay a prayer against erasure. It's possible that this relentless need to quantify, was less about greed or administration and more about anxiety. The early Mesopotamians weren't trying to control the world, they were trying to make peace with it. Modern geologists examining sediment cores from the ancient delta find clear evidence of repeated flood events during this era. Layers of fine silt alternating with heavier sand show rapid inundations, sometimes deep enough to reset agriculture for years. The same layers coincide with periods of abrupt migration in the archaeological record. People were not just adapting to the environment was rewriting them. Each time they rebuilt, they added another line to humanity's emerging memory. We often call Mesopotamia the cradle of civilization, but that cradle rocked. It swayed with every season, and out of that motion came our first attempts to steady ourselves with knowledge. The earliest calendars were circular, reflecting the river's cycles rather than linear time. The idea of history as progression had not yet been born. Instead, there was recurrence, flood, fertility, famine, and return. It would take thousands of years before someone decided that time might move forward like a river rather than around like a wheel. Archaeologists working near the ancient site of Uruk discovered a layer of burnt clay tablets dating to roughly 5,000 years ago. The fire that destroyed the storage rooms baked the records hard enough to survive until today. Among the ledgers and inventories are small notations that seem personal, a name scratched twice, a faint drawing of a fish, a symbol that might represent rain. These accidental details remind us that writing didn't appear fully formed. It grew like reeds from the mud, messy, irregular, alive. Somewhere in those same rooms a scribe might have looked out and seen the river rising again, wondering if any of this counting would matter when the water came. From a modern perspective, the genius of these early people wasn't that they mastered their environment, but that they learned to collaborate with it. They used the same clay that threatened to bury them as a medium for endurance. It's a kind of poetic symmetry. The flood teaches you what can't be trusted, and in doing so, it shows you what must be preserved. That is how memory began. Not as art, not as literature, but as flood control. When scientists reconstruct the climate of early Mesopotamia, they find that rainfall patterns grew increasingly erratic during this period, possibly due to shifts in the Indian Ocean monsoon. Crops failed unpredictably, and river salinity increased. These changes forced more centralized planning, leading to the formation of city-states. You can almost watch civilization condense from the vapor of instability. The more uncertain the sky became, the more certain the tablets had to be. What emerges from all this evidence is a portrait of humanity's oldest habit, turning fear into information. Every storm leaves a statistic, every disaster leaves a data set. Somewhere between 6,000 and 4,000 years before our era, the practice of noting became the practice of knowing. The rivers gave us both reason and religion, both science and story, intertwined in the same current. When you trace the lines of a cuneiform tablet with your fingertip, you can still feel the texture of those old anxieties, the grooves where survival and meaning first touched. The symbols look abstract to us now, but for their makers they were lifelines, the difference between being forgotten and being remembered. To write was to resist the flood not with walls but with memory itself. We will never know the name of the first person who realized that thoughts could outlast a season, or that clay could carry intention across centuries. But that moment, quiet and ordinary, is one of the few truly irreversible things our species has done. From then on, forgetting would never be absolute again. And maybe that is why, even today, we still reach for notepads, cameras and cloud drives whenever life feels uncertain. Somewhere in our wiring we are still those same river people, trying to hold back the tide by making marks. We still believe that if we can just record it, we can keep it, but the river always rises and we always begin again. If you could travel back to the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia around the dawn of the second millennium before our time, you would find a world already ancient. Cities like Shuruppak and Eridu stood on mounds built from the remains of earlier ones, each layer a chapter of rebuilding after flood or fire. Between them, the rivers still wandered, carving and erasing boundaries. Somewhere in that shifting land, a scribe pressed a reed stylus into a damp clay tablet and preserved the oldest surviving story of the world ending. We call it the Sumerian flood story. Its hero is Ziusudra, the man who listened when the gods decided that humanity's time was over. The tablet that tells his story is small, broken and silent until you learn to read its wedge-shaped script. It was found at the ancient city of Nippur and now rests in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. Only the lower portion survives. The rest has been eaten away by time. Yet even that fragment is enough to glimpse an entire cosmology, one where divine politics, human fragility, and memory itself flow together like the rivers that created the land. According to the surviving lines, the story begins not with sin or corruption, but with a decision. The gods, led by Enlil, had resolved that the seed of mankind should be destroyed. Why they chose this is unclear. The text that might have explained it has vanished. Perhaps humans had multiplied too quickly. Perhaps they had offended the gods. Or perhaps the gods were simply weary of noise and chaos, as they often were in Mesopotamian thought. Whatever the reason, the decree was final. The word of the divine assembly, the text says, cannot be revoked. It was cosmic bureaucracy in its purest form, one god's frustration becoming a line item in eternity. But not all the gods agreed. Enki, the trickster and patron of wisdom, heard the decision and was disturbed. Enki's role in Sumerian religion was complex. He was a deity of water, knowledge, and cunning, often acting as a quiet mediator between divine will and human survival. He could not defy Enlil openly. The hierarchy of heaven was absolute. So he did what he always did. He found a loophole. Through dreams or whispers, he warned a mortal named Ziusudra, described as both king and priest of the city of Shuruppak. Enki told him that the god's judgment was coming and that he must prepare a huge boat. The details of this vessel are lost to the broken portion of the tablet, but we can imagine it. Reeds bound with bitumen, curved planks sealed with pitch, a floating fragment of civilization. For 7 days and 7 nights, the story says, the storm raged. The winds howled, the rivers overflowed, and darkness covered the world. Then, silence. When the sun god Utu finally appeared, his light broke through the clouds, and Ziusudra opened a window in the great boat. The rays of the sun entered, illuminating the faces of the survivors. Humanity had outlasted its own erasure. The story ends not with destruction, but with reward. Ziusudra offers sacrifices of gratitude, and Enlil, moved by this act, relents. The god who ordered the flood now grants Ziusudra eternal life. The final lines declare that Enlil and Enki together bestowed life like a god upon him, and set him to dwell in Dilmun, a paradisiacal land sometimes imagined as an island where the rivers of the world meet. There, the hero of the flood lives forever, a bridge between divine and human realms. To modernise the Sumerian flood story is extraordinary not only for what it says, but for what it represents. The first known literary record of global catastrophe. It's not just an echo of natural disaster. It's a coded reflection of the relationship between people and the unpredictable world that shaped them. In this myth, the flood is not a punishment for moral failing, but a natural extension of divine governance. The gods maintain balance. Humanity simply suffers the consequences when balance tips. It's a worldview born from observation of rivers that giveth and taketh away, where survival depended on Ziusudra's tale also captures a shift in human imagination. Before this, Mesopotamian myths focused on creation and fertility, the ordering of chaos into cosmos. The flood story introduces a new concept. That order itself can collapse. For a culture that lived at the mercy of the rivers, this was not speculation, but lived experience. The ruins of Sumerian cities show repeated layers of flood deposits, suggesting that at least once every few generations, entire communities were washed away. The memory of such events would have seeped into their religious consciousness. Each time they rebuilt, they told the story again, this time with a moral, a warning, a lesson about humility before forces beyond control. Interpreting the moods of nature as messages from the heavens, one of the most intriguing details of the Ziusudra text is its ending. Immortality, in Sumerian thought, was not a gift lightly given. The gods themselves were immortal, but humans were not meant to be. Granting eternal life to a mortal was an admission of divine guilt, a way to make amends for near genocide. In this sense, Ziusudra is less a hero than a survivor by accident, chosen to carry memory forward. The idea that knowledge and righteousness could earn a kind of transcendence would echo through later ages, transforming from literal immortality to the endurance of reputation, then to the idea of the soul. The physical tablet itself tells another story, one of rediscovery. It was unearthed in the 19th century during excavations led by American archaeologists fascinated by biblical parallels. When scholars first translated its lines, they realized they were reading something far older than the Book of Genesis, an original source for the flood motif that would later spread across civilizations. The excitement was palpable. Here, on a piece of baked clay, was proof that the flood myth had roots deep in the Bronze Age, long before any Hebrew scribe set pen to parchment. It was as if the earth itself had remembered. For historians, the Sumerian flood story offers a window into how ancient people used myth to negotiate trauma. Imagine watching your city vanish underwater, the temples collapsing, your family scattered. To explain such devastation, you would need a story large enough to contain both fear and meaning. The flood provided that story. It wasn't just about water, it was about cycles of destruction and renewal, about the fragility of human order. Ziusudra's boat becomes a metaphor for civilization itself, fragile, handcrafted, drifting through chaos. The tablet also preserves something subtler, tone. Even in translation, the language carries a sense of solemn inevitability. The god's decision is administrative, almost procedural. The flood is not described in fiery emotion, but in measured observation. The wind, the rain, the darkness. It's bureaucracy at the scale of creation. This calmness might reflect the Sumerian view of divinity as an extension of natural law, powerful, inscrutable, but not malicious. To survive, humans had to learn not just to pray, but to predict, to read signs in the wind and stars. Ziusudra's obedience is less about faith than about attentiveness. He listens when others do not. Archaeologists who study Mesopotamian religion often point out that Enlil and Enki represent two sides of humanity's relationship with nature. Enlil is the storm, the unseen force that can destroy or bless without warning. Enki is the water itself, necessary for life, but impossible to confine. The tension between them mirrors the tension between chaos and order, between destruction and wisdom. Ziusudra stands in the middle, not as a warrior or a prophet, but as a listener, a mediator who survives by understanding that both forces must be respected. When you look closely at the surviving tablet, you can still see the impressions of the stylus strokes, each one a physical echo of a human hand nearly 4,000 years old. The lines are small, tidy, precise, as if the scribe understood the weight of what he was preserving. It's easy to forget that these ancient storytellers were not writing for us. They were writing for continuity, for the next flood that would wash over their descendants. Their words, pressed into clay, were insurance against forgetting. There is a quiet irony in how this story endured. The same elements that destroyed Sumer's cities, mud, water, and fire, also protected the tablets that told of their destruction. When libraries burned or were buried under sediment, the clay hardened. The disaster baked the memory into stone. In that sense, Ziusudra's immortality came true not just in myth, but in material fact. His story survived in the very medium of catastrophe. We don't know how widely the flood story circulated among the Sumerians. Perhaps it was recited in temples, or taught to scribes as a moral exercise. What we do know is that its themes of divine regret and human endurance struck a chord that would resonate for millennia. Later cultures would reinterpret it, amplify it, and weave it into their own cosmologies. But before all of those retellings, before the names changed and the theology evolved, there was simply a king in a boat, and a world being remade by water. Today, scientists studying ancient climate records have found evidence of a major flood event in southern Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, possibly triggered by shifts in rainfall or river avulsion. While this doesn't prove the myth, it shows that its roots are realistic. Myth often begins as memory sharpened by fear. The story of Ziusudra may have been the human attempt to hold on to that memory long after the silt had covered the ruins. The beauty of this early narrative is its humility. It doesn't claim to explain everything. It accepts that humans live at the mercy of forces they cannot control. Its moral, if it has one, is simply to pay attention, to listen for warnings, whether from gods or from the rising water itself. That humility may be the oldest form of wisdom we have. So the first written apocalypse was not a prophecy of the future, but a recollection of the past, a memory carved in clay that somehow drifted through time and found us. And in reading it, we become, for a moment, the listeners again. The flood has passed, the water is receding, and one man steps out of his boat into the silence of a new world. If the first reason the gods ever gave for ending the world was noise, then humanity started its history as an annoyance. That is the premise of one of the oldest surviving epics of the ancient world, the story of Atrahasis. Written in the Akkadian language on clay tablets nearly 4,000 years ago, it is the Mesopotamian answer to why we exist, why we suffer, and why the gods can't seem to get a good night's sleep. According to the story, the world began when the elder gods, the Anunnaki, forced a younger class of deities called the Agigi to dig canals, tend fields, and maintain the rhythms of creation. For 2,000 years, these divine labourers toiled in the heat, raising mounds and moving silt while the higher gods watched from above. Finally, the workers revolted. In a kind of heavenly labour strike, they threw down their shovels, surrounded Enlil's temple, and demanded relief. To solve the crisis, the gods decided to create replacements, beings made from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed deity. Those replacements were us. For a time, the plan worked. Humans laboured, built cities, offered sacrifices, and fed the gods with their devotion. But as generations multiplied, so did the sound. The world became loud with the hum of human life. Children crying, animals braying, hammers ringing, songs rising from markets and shrines. In the divine realm, the noise drifted upward like smoke, and the god Enlil, chief of the pantheon, could no longer bear it. The text puts it simply and almost humorously. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. That line, carved in cuneiform, might be the earliest written complaint in history. It is petty, cosmic, and relatable all at once. The great storm god, exhausted by humanity's chatter, calls a meeting of the divine assembly. The other gods agree that the world has become unbearable. Their solution is incremental at first. Enlil tries to thin the population through a series of disasters, drought, famine, and plague, each meant to quiet the din. But each time, one god intervenes to save humanity, Enki, the same god of wisdom and water who saved Ziusudra in the earlier Sumerian story. Enki quietly warns a chosen man named Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, teaching him how to survive the punishments through ritual and reason. When Enlil blocks the rain, Enki instructs Atrahasis to organize offerings that appease the gods of water. When disease spreads, Enki tells him to build altars that purify the air. Each time the world nears extinction, intellect and empathy intervene to preserve it, but the noise returns. Civilization cannot help itself. Survival means population, and population means sound. Finally, Enlil decides on the ultimate reset, a flood to drown every living thing. Enki, unable to defy the decree openly, resorts to a trick. He speaks not to Atrahasis directly, but to the wall of Atrahasis' reed house, knowing the man will overhear. Through this clever loophole, he gives instructions for building a massive circular boat, a coracle, to ride out the storm. The instructions are detailed, technical, and remarkably specific. The boat is to be built of reeds, sealed with bitumen, and constructed on a circular plan. Its width and length are to be the same, a design known for stability rather than speed. The Ark of Atrahasis is not a sleek ship. It is a floating sphere, a giant basket meant to bob through chaos. This description aligns uncannily with real Mesopotamian technology. Archaeologists and ethnographers have documented coracle boats used along the Tigris and Euphrates well into modern times. They were made by weaving reeds into a dome-like frame and coating the outside with pitch, a natural petroleum substance that seeps from the ground in the region. Large versions of these boats, called kufa, could carry dozens of people or animals. They were nearly impossible to capsize, though equally impossible to steer. The ancient storyteller took a familiar piece of river engineering and magnified it into mythic scale. The gods, after all, didn't need ships with rudders. They needed a vessel that would simply not sink. When the flood begins, the poem shifts into an almost cinematic rhythm. The storm and flood raged together. Like brothers they came. For 7 days and 7 nights, the winds howl and the waters rise, obliterating the land. The noise of humanity, the very thing that drove the gods to fury, is replaced by another kind of noise, the endless roar of the deluge. The world is reduced to sound without shape, then silence. Atrahasis opens a window, sunlight falls on his face, and he sees that everything is water. In the aftermath, he releases birds to search for dry land. When none return, he waits. When one finally fails to come back, he knows the waters have receded. He offers a sacrifice to the gods, burning sweet-smelling wood. The hungry deities, deprived of offerings for days, swarm around the smoke like flies. It is one of the earliest moments of irony in world literature. The same gods who tried to erase mankind now crave the scent of his cooking. The story ends in uneasy reconciliation. Enlil, furious that anyone survived, demands to know who betrayed his plan. Enki admits it, defending humanity as necessary to the divine order. Without humans, he argues, there would be no temples, no food offerings, no recognition of the gods at all. The assembly relents. Together they decide that in the future, rather than flooding the entire world, they will impose limits. Shorter human lifespans, natural disasters and infertility. Partial resets to keep the noise manageable. It's an ancient attempt to rationalize mortality. Death is not punishment, it's population control. The genius of the Atrahasis epic is that it combines mythic scale with bureaucratic realism. The gods act like administrators managing an overburdened system. Their decisions are formalized in meetings, their punishments follow procedure, and their remorse is practical rather than moral. This isn't theology in the modern sense, it's an early psychology of power. The divine hierarchy mirrors the palace administration of ancient Mesopotamia, where kings relied on scribes, accountants, and priests to keep order in a chaotic environment. By projecting human politics onto the cosmos, the story explains the unpredictability of life through the familiar logic of authority. Things go wrong because the management is conflicted. Yet beneath this irony lies genuine insight into how early civilizations understood balance. The Mesopotamians saw the universe as an ecosystem of exchange. Gods, humans, animals, and nature all depending on one another. Excess in any form, whether noise, population, or pride, invited correction. The flood was not revenge. It was equilibrium reasserting itself. Enki's compassion and Enlil's anger are two sides of the same coin, creation and destruction as continuous forces. From a historical perspective, the Atrahasis tablets give scholars invaluable clues about daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. The attention to materials, reeds, bitumen, wood, reflects the technological reality of the floodplain. The mention of drought, famine, and epidemic corresponds to real environmental cycles in the region, around the mid-2nd millennium before our era. Sediment analysis shows periods of climate instability, including abrupt droughts followed by sudden floods. The story may have grown from collective memory of these extremes, shaped by the need to find meaning in natural rhythms that no one could control. What makes the Atrahasis epic particularly moving is its sense of weary humour. Humanity's crime is not violence or greed, but volume. It's a satire of our own restlessness. The same vitality that built cities also disturbs the heavens. In a way, the story anticipates our modern anxieties, that our species might one day make so much noise, literal or metaphorical, that the world itself reacts. The circular boat at the centre of the narrative has become a symbol of survival through absurdity. It doesn't conquer the flood, it endures it. In that shape lies a quiet philosophy. Perfection is not progress, but balance. The ark's geometry mirrors the Mesopotamian understanding of the cosmos as a great circle, the heavens above, the waters below, and humanity drifting somewhere in between. When the first scholars translated the Atrahasis tablets in the 19th century, they were struck by its sophistication. Far from being a primitive legend, it reads like an early meditation on law, ecology, and consciousness. The gods' fatigue mirrors human fatigue. Their negotiations sound like committee minutes. It's the world's oldest workplace drama, written by people who knew too well how fragile order could be when the waters rose. And still, the epic ends not with despair, but with compromise. The gods and humans reach an uneasy understanding. Noise, after all, is the sound of a life continuing. The solution is not silence, but moderation. Atrahasis himself fades from the story. His wisdom becomes proverbial, his name a reminder that reason can coexist with faith. Thousands of years later, archaeologists still find the same bitumen-stained reeds in ancient harbours, the same rounded boat impressions in river mud. The technology of survival has outlasted the theology that inspired it. That is the quiet triumph of humanity's noise. It endures in what we build, what we remember, and what we retell. Maybe that's the deeper lesson of Atrahasis, that creation's greatest flaw and its greatest strength are the same. We are loud, we are persistent, and against the endless murmuring of the earth our voices, however small, still reach the heavens. If you could travel back to Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, you would not find sleek ships cutting through the water. You would find baskets, giant ones, drifting like bowls on the rivers. The first ark of humanity's imagination was not a ship built to sail, but a vessel designed to float, a circle engineered for survival rather than conquest. That design, known to the ancients as a coracle, may have been the earliest proof that simplicity could outlast catastrophe. The coracle is one of the oldest watercraft ever built by human hands. Its descendants have been used from India to Wales, but its true home lies in the marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the story of civilization itself began. The geography of that world shaped its technology. Every year, floods would rise from snowmelt in the north and spread across the low plains of southern Mesopotamia. The land was flat, open, and unprotected. Roads were useless during the wet season, so people turned the rivers into their highways. Out of reeds, rope, and tar, they built boats that could be assembled, launched, and repaired by hand. Boats that were light enough to carry across sand and sturdy enough to ride swollen water. Unlike the later wooden ships of the Mediterranean, coracles were woven, not carved. They began with a framework of flexible branches bent into ribs and lashed together to form a dome-shaped skeleton. Onto this, craftsmen wove layers of reeds or palm fibre in tight spirals, binding each loop with ropes made from date palm or goat hair. The result was a giant bowl, smooth, round, and weightless. Once completed, the shell was coated on the outside with bitumen, the same black tar that seeps naturally from the earth around modern-day Iraq. When dry, the bitumen hardened into a waterproof skin, sealing the vessel so completely that it could float even when overloaded with passengers or cargo. Archaeologists have found evidence of this tradition stretching back to at least the early Bronze Age. Ancient reliefs from the city of Ur show curved basket-like boats ferrying livestock and jars across canals. Later, Assyrian carvings depict soldiers crossing rivers in circular vessels nearly identical in shape to those still used by fishermen in Iraq well into the 20th century. These living coracles, called kufa, could reach several metres across and carry loads of several tons. Their bottoms were slightly flattened to improve stability, and their sides rose just high enough to keep out the waves. With a single oar, one person could guide it downstream, though the boat itself was more likely to spin than to steer. For most of history, the coracle was a tool of the poor, practical, humble, and made from whatever the river provided. But in the Mesopotamian imagination, it became something more, a symbol of endurance. When the flood myths of the region took shape, the coracle became the model for salvation, not because it was grand, but because it was unsinkable. When British archaeologist and Assyriologist Irving Finkel first translated the so-called Ark tablet in 2014, he was struck by one phrase. The ancient scribe, who wrote it around the early 2nd millennium before our era, described the Ark not as a long rectangle, but as a perfect circle. The tablet, written in Akkadian cuneiform, gave specific instructions for its construction. Draw out the boat that you will make on a circular plan. Let her length and breadth be equal. It even described the materials in the same terms used for real Mesopotamian coracles, reeds bound with rope, covered in bitumen, divided into compartments for animals and supplies. To Finkel, this was no coincidence. The mythical Ark, he realized, was based on a real, familiar boat that anyone in ancient Mesopotamia would have recognized instantly. Finkel's insight transformed how we understand these old stories. The Ark was never imagined as an impossibly large ship built by divine carpenters. It was modelled after the same circular coracles that had plied those rivers for thousands of years. The storyteller took a symbol of everyday survival and elevated it into cosmic myth. The gods could have chosen any design, but they chose the one that always floated. Bitumen, that strange natural tar that oozed from the ground, was essential to this technology. It was collected from pits or riverbanks where the earth leaked black oil. Workers softened it with heat, mixed it with ash or sand, and spread it over the reeds while still warm. When cooled, it formed a hard, waterproof coating that kept water out and air in. The same substance sealed bricks in ziggurats, lined canals, and glued jewellery. In the flood stories, the command to pitch it within and without with bitumen was not poetic. It was engineering advice. To a Mesopotamian listener, that instruction would have sounded as practical as saying cork the seams. The bitumen gave these vessels a characteristic smell, thick, mineral, slightly sweet, that must have clung to riverbanks and harbours. It is the scent of the world's first chemistry. Modern archaeologists still encounter it in excavations, preserved as dark stains in clay layers or as hardened fragments in pottery. It connects the technological and the mythological in a single sensory memory. The same tar that waterproofed the first boats also built the temples of the gods who ruled the floods. When modern experiments tried to recreate Finkel's circular ark, the results were astonishing. Engineers and craftsmen in India and the United Kingdom built a coracle more than 20 metres wide using traditional methods. Despite its enormous size, the boat floated perfectly, rising and falling with the waves without tipping. It was, in essence, a stable raft disguised as a basket. Its circular symmetry meant that pressure was evenly distributed. No single part bore the strain. The design required no keel, no nails, and no advanced tools, just geometry and patience. This practicality reveals something about the ancient mindset. The builders of the flood myths did not imagine miracles out of nothing. They imagined familiar technologies stretched to divine proportions. Their gods were engineers who understood materials. When they told stories of survival, they grounded them in the real physics of their environment. The round boat that would not sink was not fantasy. It was the memory of a real solution to a recurring problem. The floods that came every year, sometimes gentle, sometimes catastrophic. The coracle also reflected the philosophy of its creators. In a world without compasses or straight roads, the circle symbolized order and completeness. Temples, cities, and even time itself were conceived in cycles. The round boat embodied that worldview. It did not cut through the water as ships later would. It turned with the current, yielding instead of resisting. Its motion mirrored the Mesopotamian understanding of fate. One cannot stop the flood, only ride it until it passes. In that sense, the Ark of Atrahasis is not just a survival craft. It is a metaphor for wisdom. When Enki instructs his chosen human to build a coracle, he's not offering escape from nature but harmony with it. The design accepts instability as part of life. It has no front, no back, no illusion of control, just balance. That is perhaps why the story endured. It described not only how to build a boat but how to live through chaos. Archaeological and textual evidence show that coracle building remained part of Mesopotamian culture for millennia. Greek historians like Herodotus described seeing these round boats on the rivers of Babylon in the 5th century before our era. He marvelled that they were covered in leather and carried barrels of wine as cargo, sometimes so large they needed multiple rowers. He noted too that after reaching their destination, the boats were dismantled and the materials carried back upstream on donkeys because the current was too strong to row against. The idea of disposable, circular boats moving goods downriver persisted from the Bronze Age to the classical world. In a way, every voyage was one way, like time itself, The rediscovery of these vessels in the 19th and 20th centuries gave archaeologists tangible proof that myth and engineering had once shared a common origin. When researchers in southern Iraq filmed villagers still building coracles from reeds and tar, the continuity felt almost supernatural. Thousands of years had passed, yet the technique remained unchanged. Watching those black baskets glide silently across the water, one can imagine how the ancients saw divinity in craftsmanship. If the coracle was the earliest ark, then the flood story was the world's first user manual for surviving disaster. Its instructions were clear: build with what the earth provides, trust in what floats, and know that endurance is circular. Each year, the rivers rose and fell, bringing destruction and renewal. Each season repeated the last. The circular boat and the circular calendar both told the same story: everything that drowns will one day rise again. Perhaps that is why the image of the coracle, humble as it is, has outlasted every empire built on its shores. Its design needs no improvement because it is not about progress. It is about continuity. The people who first built it did not seek to conquer nature, but to participate in its rhythm. In their hands, reeds and tar became a kind of scripture, one that still floats even when stone and bronze have sunk. When Irving Finkel read the Ark tablet aloud for the first time, he laughed at the irony. Humanity's oldest tale of divine punishment and survival hinged on the simplest piece of technology imaginable: a basket. Yet that basket carried the weight of civilization. It proved that knowledge, once recorded, can drift across millennia, surviving flood after flood. The boat that would not sink became the story that could not die. In the end, the round ark of Mesopotamia is less a miracle of gods than a testament to humans who refuse to drown. It is proof that memory, like bitumen, hardens with time. What began as reeds and rope became myth and scripture, and beneath it all, the logic remains as sound as it ever was. When the waters rise, make something that floats. If the Atrahasis epic begins as the story of noisy humans, it ends as the story of remorseful gods. Few ancient texts turn the lens of guilt upward, toward the heavens themselves, but this one does. In its final act, the flood has ended. The waters are receding, and silence has returned. Yet that silence does not bring peace. It brings regret. The gods who have destroyed their own creation find themselves facing the consequences of perfection taken too far. According to the Akkadian tablets, the deluge lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, long enough to erase every living sound. When the flood finally ceased, the earth was a wasteland of mud. No animals, no people, no prayers. In that emptiness, the gods began to feel something new: hunger. In Mesopotamian thought, the gods were not sustained by abstract divinity, but by offerings. The smoke of human sacrifices, the scent of roasted grain and incense was their nourishment. When the world went silent, so did their meals. The myth turns this idea into a darkly comic scene. The gods swarm around the first sacrifice that rises from the ark, like flies, desperate for the smell of cooking flesh. The humour hides something profound. The flood has proven that divine power is self-destructive when it severs its link with humanity. Without humans, even gods starve. The leading figure in this remorse is the goddess Nintu, sometimes called Beletili, Lady of the Gods. She was the mother who helped create humankind in the beginning, mixing clay with divine blood. During the flood, she watches her children drown. The tablets describe her pacing, weeping, her lips trembling. The great goddess wept. Her lips were covered with fever. The Anunnaki gods sat bowed and wept with her. It is one of the earliest portrayals of divine empathy in human writing. The goddess who once shaped life from earth now mourns the loss of her own creation. This image, gods crying over their own mistake, marks a quiet revolution in thought. Before Atrahasis, divine punishment in myth was simple and absolute. Gods destroyed because they could, and mortals endured because they must. Here, however, the storytellers imagine a moral universe where even gods are capable of reflection. Power is no longer free from consequence. Creation carries responsibility, and destruction invites remorse. It is the first whisper of self-awareness in theology. In the story, Enlil, the god who ordered the flood, returns to survey the damage. He expects triumph, but finds devastation. When he sees the Ark resting on the mountain and realizes that some humans have survived, he explodes with fury. "Who has escaped?" he demands. No man was to survive the annihilation. Yet beneath his rage lies insecurity. The perfection of his plan has failed, and the world he wanted silent has begun to speak again. His fellow deity Enki steps forward, calm and rational, and admits to warning Atrahasis. But he defends his disobedience with reason. "Lay not your hand upon the righteous. Lay punishment upon the sinner. Let the lion rise to diminish the people. Let famine and disease do the work of balance." Here, Enki proposes a compromise, a moral economy of punishment. Instead of annihilation, there should be limitation. Instead of erasing all life, the gods should learn to manage it. This conversation, preserved in brittle clay, may be the oldest recorded debate over proportional justice. It suggests that the flood was not just a natural event mythologized, but an ethical crisis dramatized. The gods learn painfully that absolute control destroys the very system it depends on. In that sense, Atrahasis is less a tale of sin than of feedback. The gods make, the gods unmake, and then realize they too are bound by the laws of what they have made. It is the first myth to acknowledge that creation is a closed loop. The storyteller's genius lies in using divine characters to explore human psychology. Enlil's impatience mirrors the tyranny of rulers. Nintu's sorrow mirrors the compassion of mothers. Enki's pragmatism mirrors the wisdom of elders who know that life survives not through perfection but through adjustment. The famine scenes that precede the flood reinforce this theme. Before resorting to total destruction, Enlil attempts to quiet humanity through hunger and drought. For 6 years the rivers shrink, crops wither, and people grow thin. The text lingers on these years with eerie detail. Families eat seed grain, mothers refuse to nurse, temples fall silent. It is not the flood, but the famine that first tests the god's conscience. Each time, Enki intervenes to save a remnant. Each time, the balance between discipline and compassion tips back towards survival. By the time the flood arrives, the audience already understands that Enlil's decision is excessive. The flood is not just an event, it is an overreaction. What follows after the flood is a reordering of the universe. The gods convene, and Enki outlines new rules for humanity. Shorter lives, less fertility, more mortality. Death becomes a necessary function to prevent future overpopulation. The flood becomes a cosmic regulation policy. It is the mythic equivalent of discovering ecological balance. Rather than divine wrath alone, it is divine course correction. This moral evolution in Atrahasis stands out in the ancient world. Mesopotamian religion was not known for gentle gods. It was a system of fear, ritual, and exchange. Yet here, in this one epic, the storytellers allow for tenderness and regret. The divine is no longer immune to emotion. The goddess who weeps, the god who defends mercy, even the god who regrets too late, all are part of a more complex cosmos where morality itself is emerging from chaos. It is possible that the scribes who composed Atrahasis lived through real disasters that shaped this worldview. Archaeological evidence shows that southern Mesopotamia experienced major floods and droughts around the middle of the second millennium before our era. Cities were periodically abandoned, crops failed, and temple economies collapsed. To people who depended on irrigation, water was both the giver and the taker of life. The flood myth would have resonated as both memory and metaphor. It explained why the gods sometimes seemed cruel, because the forces of nature, though divine in origin, were unpredictable and self-correcting. But the story does something more subtle. It teaches that even the gods are capable of learning. The flood is not the end of creation, but the end of arrogance. It replaces divine omnipotence with divine accountability. In this way, the Atrahasis epic prefigures later philosophical ideas about justice, balance, and repentance, not as commandments, but as natural laws. One of the most striking passages describes the return of smell. After Atrahasis offers his sacrifice, the smoke rises in silence until the gods, starved and ashamed, approach. The text says, "The gods gathered like flies around the offering." To modernize, it reads as dark comedy, but to the ancient audience, it would have carried a note of recognition. The smell of food, the smoke of fire. These were signs that the world had restarted, that the bridge between humans and gods was open again. The restoration of smell is the restoration of relationship. It means the universe is breathing again. In later Mesopotamian literature, Enlil is not vilified for his actions, but he is never again unchallenged. His authority remains, but his judgment is tempered. The flood becomes a precedent for restraint. The same stories that once celebrated divine might now honour divine humility. It is as though the storytellers realise that omnipotence without empathy is sterile. There is an almost modern irony in all this. The gods' problem with humanity was noise. Their solution created silence, and in that silence they found despair. The story seems to suggest that the world, even to its creators, is meant to be noisy. The hum of life, the prayers, the festivals, the crying of infants, all are the music of existence. The flood's lesson is that tranquility without life is emptiness. The gods, for all their power, miss the sound of the living. This is why the Atrahasis epic endures. It is not merely the ancestor of later flood myths. It is one of the first pieces of literature to express remorse as sacred. In its clay lines, one can almost hear the murmur of scribes realizing that justice and mercy are intertwined. The gods are mirrors, reflecting our own contradictions back at us. The desire for order, the guilt of excess, the longing for redemption. In the final lines, Enki and Nintu swear an oath that the flood will never happen again. Instead, humanity will live under limits, painful but sustainable ones. The text closes not with triumph or despair, but with compromise. Creation continues, scarred but wiser. The gods return to their temples, and humans return to their work. The rivers rise and fall as they always have, and somewhere in the mud the memory of regret hardens into clay. We cannot know whether the Mesopotamian poets intended this as theology, philosophy, or simply a good story. What we do know is that they imagined a world where even divinity could grow. In that idea lies the seed of everything that came after, the notion that power, to remain sacred, must be capable of pity. When the Epic of Gilgamesh finally reaches its 11th tablet, it feels as though the story pauses to look backward through time. The king of Uruk, having defeated monsters, defied gods, and buried his dearest friend, goes in search of something far more elusive than glory. He seeks to know why life must end. The answer, he is told, belongs to one man alone, Utnapishtim, the human who survived the flood and was granted eternal life. It is one of the oldest recorded conversations about mortality, and it takes place not in a temple or a battlefield, but on a desolate shore, between a king terrified of death and a man who has already lived too long. By the time this version of the flood story was written, Mesopotamia had changed. Empires had risen and fallen, scribes had copied and recopied ancient myths until they became something like scripture. The version we know comes from a set of clay tablets written in Akkadian and discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, dating to roughly the 7th century BCE century before our era, though older fragments suggest the tale was circulating 6 centuries earlier. What makes the Gilgamesh flood so haunting is not just its age, but its placement within a larger epic that wrestles with grief. The flood is no longer a standalone myth. It is a memory inside a memory, a story within a story told to a man who has lost the friend who once made him feel immortal. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, he finds not a glowing demigod, but an old man living by the edge of the world, where the rivers flow into the sea of death. Tell me, Gilgamesh pleads, how you came to possess the life that does not end. The flood survivor sighs and begins to speak. What follows is the oldest retelling of Apocalypse in first person, carved in careful wedges of cuneiform more than 2,500 years ago. Utnapishtim's story begins much as Atrahasis' did. The gods had grown tired of humanity. Their noise, their endless building, their expansion into every field and city became unbearable. The god Enlil once again calls for silence, the same divine exhaustion that ended the world before. But another god, Ea, known elsewhere as Enki, decides to warn one man. He does not speak to Utnapishtim directly, but whispers through a wall, instructing him to tear down his house and build a boat. "Abandon possessions," he says, "and save the seed of all living things." The Gilgamesh version includes instructions that are both technical and poetic. The boat must be enormous, its sides equal in length and height, forming a perfect cube. The text reads, "Her dimensions shall measure equal in length and breadth. Her form shall be perfectly proportioned." Scholars have long debated whether this detail represents misunderstanding or symbolism, but its meaning feels clear. This ark is not designed for navigation. It is a container for life itself, an artificial mountain afloat on chaos. The cube, a shape of symmetry and stillness, suggests the attempt to impose order upon disaster, geometry upon emotion. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm rages. The floodwind blew, the tempest swirled, submerging the land. The noise of rain and thunder replaces the noise of humanity. The gods themselves are terrified of what they have unleashed. They huddle like dogs at the edge of heaven, cowering before their own storm. It is one of the most striking images in ancient literature, the divine reduced to panic. The storyteller offers no comfort. Even the immortals can lose control of their creations. On the 7th day, silence returns. The sea lies still, and the entire world has become a single, endless horizon of water. Utnapishtim opens a window, the same word used for light, and the sun god's rays fall on his face. He weeps. The ark comes to rest on Mount Nision, a name that in Akkadian means protection or salvation. For 7 more days it remains grounded until Utnapishtim begins to test the air. He releases a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven. The raven does not return, signalling that the waters have receded. The parallel to older Mesopotamian versions is obvious, yet here it serves a different emotional purpose. Utnapishtim's test is not curiosity, but exhaustion. He releases the birds not just to find land, but to find an end. When he finally leaves the ark, he builds an altar and makes a sacrifice. The smell of the offering rises and the gods descend like flies. The phrase is carried over from Atrahasis, but here it becomes satire. The hunger of the gods, denied for days, turns them into swarming insects. The storyteller is mocking the very beings his culture once feared most. It is rare in ancient writing to find such a sharp edge of humour directed at divinity. The priests who copied these lines must have done so with careful reverence, knowing they preserved a kind of heresy disguised as myth. When Enlil arrives and sees that life has survived, his fury is instant. "How could anyone escape?" he demands. But Ea, his rival, answers calmly, "Punish the sinner, not the innocent. Lay waste through famine or plague, but do not destroy all." The speech is nearly identical to the one given by Enki and Atrahasis centuries earlier, but in the Gilgamesh version, it carries new weight. It is not merely a debate about justice, it is the articulation of memory itself. Ea is reminding Enlil of what they once did and regretted. The gods are learning slowly through repetition, as humans do. In the end, Enlil softens. He blesses Utnapishtim and his wife, declaring that they will live forever, far away at the mouth of the rivers. But the reward is ambiguous. Immortality in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not triumph. It is exile. Utnapishtim and his wife are sent to dwell in a distant, unreachable land, separated from both gods and humans. They become symbols of what cannot be repeated. The flood will not happen again, but neither will the gift of eternal life. The cost of knowledge is isolation. When Gilgamesh hears this, he is silent. He has travelled across deserts and seas to find the secret of life, only to learn that the one man who possesses it is condemned to solitude. The survivor of the flood becomes a warning, not an ideal. There is no permanence, Utnapishtim tells him. Do we build houses forever? Do brothers divide inheritance forever? The river itself rises and brings death. The tone is almost gentle, a tired teacher explaining to an eager student that existence is not meant to be permanent. The real immortality lies in memory, the stories that outlast their tellers. The Gilgamesh flood narrative is both preservation and reinterpretation. It inherits the framework of Atrahasis, the circular logic of creation and destruction, but adds an entirely human dimension. By placing the story within a conversation about grief, the epic turns myth into philosophy. the flood becomes not just a moral lesson for gods, but a mirror for mortal fear. If the gods once destroyed the world out of frustration, the hero now seeks to escape death out of the same emotion. Both acts fail for the same reason. Life depends on limits. What makes the 11th tablet remarkable is its literary craftsmanship. It is not simply myth preserved, it is myth transformed. The language is concise, rhythmic, and often ironic. The gods who tremble like dogs are followed by gods who gather like flies. The repetition of sevens, 7 days, 7 nights, 7 doves, creates a rhythm that feels almost tidal. The entire story moves like water, rising and falling with emotion. Scholars who study the tablet have noted that its composition style suggests it was meant to be recited aloud, its cadence mirroring the oral tradition from which it descended. The flood scene also reflects the growing skepticism of its time. The gods are powerful but flawed, immortal but petty. They act from fear, hunger and confusion, traits that feel deeply human. This inversion of divinity is what gives the Epic of Gilgamesh its modern resonance. It suggests that enlightenment does not come from obedience, but from understanding that even the creators are bound by consequence. Archaeologists who first read these tablets in the 19th century were startled by their tone. George Smith, the British Museum scholar who translated the flood story in 1872, famously leapt from his seat in excitement, scattering his notes. Here was an ancient Mesopotamian account of a flood, written a millennium before the text that would later echo it. Yet what struck many readers most was not its similarity to later versions, but its humanity. The gods make mistakes, the hero weeps, and the meaning of survival remains uncertain. When the conversation between Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim ends, there is no revelation, no miracle cure for mortality. Instead, the old man challenges the hero to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh, exhausted, falls asleep almost instantly. It is a quiet parable. Humans cannot conquer the limits that define them. Utnapishtim smiles with pity, not mockery. He knows that immortality, far from being a blessing, is an unending awareness of loss. The 11th tablet concludes with the flood story fading back into the frame of Gilgamesh's journey. The king returns to Uruk, older but not wiser, gazing upon the city's walls. "Look upon the ramparts," he says. "Is it not of burnt brick, and did not the 7 sages lay its foundations?" The cycle completes itself, from the destruction of the flood to the endurance of civilization. The flood becomes the memory that built the walls. Perhaps that is the real purpose of Utnapishtim's tale. It is not to promise eternal life, but to remind us that memory is the only immortality we possess. Each retelling, whether carved in clay, whispered by scribes, or heard in the dark, keeps the world from drowning again. The gods may regret, heroes may fail, but the story continues to float round and unsinkable across the centuries. Every flood story ends not in water, but in elevation. Whether it is Mount Nasir in the Gilgamesh tablets, Mount Nimush in the older Akkadian texts, or Ararat in later retellings, the Ark never drifts forever. It always finds a summit to rest upon. This pattern, so consistent across cultures, feels almost instinctive. When the world is drowned, salvation must come from above. The mountain becomes the opposite of the flood, a vertical answer to a horizontal catastrophe. In the Gilgamesh account, Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on the slopes of Mount Nizia, a name that scholars translate as protection or salvation. The text is precise, as though recording a real event. On the 7th day the boat lodged on Mount Nisir. The mountain held it fast and did not let it move. The storm has passed, but the boat cannot yet descend. It remains trapped by its own survival. This detail, the Ark immobilized on a peak, captures as deeper truth. To survive a flood is to live between 2 worlds, water below, sky above, nowhere left to go. Where, then, was Mount Nizir? The ancient scribes never marked it on a map, but the name appears again in later Babylonian inscriptions referring to a mountainous region in what is now northern Iraq or southeastern Turkey. Archaeologists have proposed several candidates, including Pir Omar Gudrun near Suleymaniya and Mount Judi near Cizre, both rugged ridges along the northern horizon of Mesopotamia. These are places where the flat plains of the Tigris suddenly rise into folded limestone peaks. For those who lived in the river valleys, they were the edge of the world, the place where storms gathered and rivers began. To imagine the Ark coming to rest, there was not only geographical logic, it was cosmological symmetry. Life had returned to the source of its waters. The choice of a mountain also fits the rhythm of Mesopotamian cosmology. In that worldview, the universe was a series of layers, the underworld below, the earth in the middle, and the heavens above. Mountains bridged these layers. They were cosmic ladders where the divine touched the human. The great ziggurats that dotted Sumerian cities, stepped pyramids rising from floodplains, were architectural mountains built to imitate that connection. When floods wiped the land clean, the only thing that could survive would be what stood above it. The Ark resting on a mountain is therefore not just a plot point. It is a visual theology. Height equals survival, because height equals proximity to the divine. Later traditions inherited this symbolism and anchored it in new geography. In the Assyrian and Babylonian retellings, the Ark lands on Mount Nimush, a name that may have referred to the same region under a different dialect. In later centuries, as languages shifted and empires changed, the name transformed again into Ararat, a mountain range rather than a single peak. Even today, Mount Ararat in modern Armenia, its twin summits covered in perpetual snow, carries the weight of this mythic continuity. Pilgrims, explorers and nationalists have searched its slopes for remnants of wood, hoping to find the physical proof of a story that was always symbolic. The mountain became not a place on a map, but a compass for meaning. The recurrence of mountains in flood mythology is not limited to Mesopotamia. In the Hindu story of Manu, the divine fish that warns of the flood instructs him to tie his boat to the peak of the Himalayas. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha drift for 9 days before their ark settles on Mount Parnassus. In both traditions, survival is followed by descent, repopulation, and renewal. The mountain, across civilizations, is the hinge between destruction and rebirth. When everything horizontal is erased, the vertical becomes sacred. There is also geology behind the poetry. The ancient Near East is a region of extremes, rivers that overflow, deserts that crack, and mountains that pierce the sky. To the early inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia, the distant northern highlands were the source of all rivers and minerals, a place of both danger and wealth. Seasonal floods came from those same mountains, carrying the silt that made the plains fertile. The mountains gave life, and occasionally too much of it. They were both the womb and the tomb of civilization. It makes sense that the same geography that caused floods would also provide the refuge from them. The story encodes environmental memory into mythic topography. There is something almost psychological about this pattern. The mountain embodies the human instinct to climb out of chaos. It is the act of looking up after being submerged. Every flood survivor, whether mythic or real, ends up seeking higher ground, not only physically but morally, spiritually or intellectually. The ascent after the deluge is always symbolic of understanding. When Utnapishtim steps onto Mount Nisir, he is not just standing on dry land, he is standing on realization. The gods have limits, and so does he. For archaeologists, the search for the mountain where the boat rested has taken many shapes. Expeditions have climbed the volcanic cone of modern Ararat, the limestone ridges of Kudidag, and the inaccessible peaks of Zagros, each hoping to find traces of ancient wood or pitch. None have succeeded, at least not in the empirical sense. Yet what they have found instead are layers of sediment, ancient flood deposits near the lower Tigris, and the remains of long-forgotten settlements periodically buried and rebuilt. In these layers lies the real mountain, the accumulation of memory itself. Myths remember landscapes even when names change. The mountain in the flood story also serves as the first altar. Once the ark rests, the survivor always builds a fire and makes an offering. The height becomes the axis of reconciliation. Earth, fire, and air mingling in one place. The smoke rising from the mountaintop is not merely gratitude, but communication, the restoration of dialogue between mortal and divine. It is the literal opposite of the flood's silence. The mountain gives the story its ending note, the sound of breath returning to the world. There is a quiet irony in this transition from water to stone. Floods erase boundaries, dissolving everything into one surface. Mountains restore distinction between land and sky, God and human, chaos and order. Yet the two elements remain connected. The flood carves the mountain directs the flood. In this endless cycle, the myth recognizes something we still wrestle with, that catastrophe and renewal are not opposites, but phases of the same process. The Ark's resting place is not a final rescue, but a pause before descent. Scholars of comparative mythology have long noted that the motif of the mountain after the flood may have deeper roots in ancient ritual. Many Near Eastern temples were built on artificial mounds, perhaps to commemorate ancestral floods, or to symbolize the primordial hill that first emerged from the cosmic sea at creation. The Ark landing on a mountain may thus echo the creation myth itself, a recreation of the world from the waters of chaos. Each flood, in this sense, resets the cosmic order, and each mountain becomes the first land rising anew. When ancient scribes wrote that the Ark rested, they chose a word that also meant ceased, settled, or found peace. It implies that the mountain is not just elevation but resolution. The story ends with stillness. The wind has died, the water has retreated, and the gods, for once, are quiet. The image of the Ark perched motionless on stone may have comforted generations who lived in the shadow of floods. It promised that even the wildest forces could find a limit. Modern readers sometimes forget how literal this imagery once was. For the inhabitants of the floodplain, a single rise in the landscape could mean life or death. Even small hills, islands, or river levees became sacred during inundations. Over time, these practical refuges merged with cosmic symbolism until the humble act of climbing to safety became an ascent toward eternity. The myth magnified survival into revelation. In a broader sense, the mountain embodies humanity's oldest instinct, to seek perspective. When the flood ends, the survivor always looks down, surveying what remains. From that height, the scale of loss becomes visible, but so does the possibility of beginning again. The mountain is both grave and cradle, vantage point and origin story. If you strip away the names Nisir, Nimush, Ararat, what remains is a single enduring idea, that knowledge itself is a form of height. The flood destroys ignorance, complacency and excess. The mountain restores awareness. Perhaps that is why the flood stories, though separated by centuries, all end the same way. They do not close with drowning, but with elevation. The survivor climbs, looks, and remembers. The mountain becomes the first library shelf of the world, the place where memory dries in the sun. When stories travel farther than armies, they change not by conquest, but by translation. Somewhere between the Euphrates and the hills of Canaan, a story written in clay began to whisper in another tongue. It was not carried by prophets or kings, but by scribes, merchants, and exiles who carried their memories like contraband across rivers. The great flood of Mesopotamia, once pressed into wet clay by Sumerian and Akkadian hands, did not remain confined to the plains where it was born. Over the centuries it moved westward, absorbed, reimagined, and rewritten, until the tablets became scrolls, and the flood of Enlil became the flood of the Lord. But long before that transformation, the story drifted quietly through the channels of human contact, carried by trade, migration, and captivity. By the second millennium before the Common Era, the flood story was already ancient in Mesopotamia. The clay tablets that told of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim were copied and recopied in temples and scribal schools from Nippur to Nineveh. Each generation of scribes inherited not only the text, but the habit of commentary, clarifying a word here, adding a god there, shaping myth into theology. Cuneiform culture was not static. It was a living archive, and its influence spread wherever its language of administration, Akkadian, was understood. By the first millennium before the Common Era, that meant almost everywhere between the Persian Gulf and the Levant. Akkadian was the diplomatic and scholarly language of the region, the script that kings used for treaties and traders used for accounts. In its syllabic wedges lay the shared memory of the flood. Meanwhile, along the Mediterranean's eastern edge, smaller kingdoms were forming and dissolving: Aram, Phoenicia, Israel, Judah. These cultures borrowed and blended freely. Egyptian symbols mingled with Canaanite myths. Hittite hymns found new echoes in Hebrew psalms. The Near East was less a mosaic than a tide pool of ideas, and myths flowed like sediment through its currents. What we call borrowing may have felt more like osmosis, inevitable contact between peoples who traded olive oil, cedar wood, and copper across caravan routes older than writing itself. When the Babylonian Empire rose to dominance under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century before the Common Era, the flood myth found one of its most important conduits: forced migration. In the year 587 before the Common Era, Babylon conquered Judah and exiled many of its elite citizens. Among them were scribes and priests, people whose profession was remembering. They arrived in a city whose libraries already held millennia of myth on clay shelves. In those archives lay the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, and their countless variants. The exiled scholars who could read Akkadian suddenly had access to the intellectual treasury of Mesopotamia. Even those who could not read the wedge-shaped script would have heard the stories recited in the streets, carved into palace reliefs, or spoken by Babylonian storytellers who had been retelling them for 1,000 years. Exile is disorienting, but it is also a kind of cultural apprenticeship. When the Judean scribes began to record their own cosmologies and histories during this period, they did so in the shadow of the world's first literature. It is easy to imagine them walking past the great ziggurat of Marduk, a mountain of bricks that mirrored the very stories of divine hubris and flood survival they would later echo. Babylon was not just a city, it was an encyclopedia in clay. Its scholars catalogued star charts, omen lists, hymns, laws, and myths with an obsessive precision that impressed even later Greek historians. The flood stories were not folklore but curriculum. Every scribal student learned them as part of mastering language itself. In this environment, stories did not belong to one people or one god. They were public property, available to any civilization that wanted to explain why the world was full of ruins. The transfer of ideas between Mesopotamia and the Levant was not a single event but a gradual seepage. Some scholars point to earlier cultural bridges centuries before the Babylonian exile, when Canaanite city-states traded directly with Mesopotamian powers. Tablets discovered at Ugarit on the Syrian coast show how scribes adapted foreign myths into local pantheons, substituting names while keeping the structure intact. If this practice reached as far south as Judah, the seeds of Mesopotamian mythology may have been planted even before the exile, later blooming in the hands of displaced writers. The flood story, like all successful myths, survived because it could evolve without losing its emotional truth. Whether it was Enlil, Enki, or a singular deity deciding humanity's fate, the structure of divine judgment followed by mercy remained constant. But to understand how these ideas travelled, we have to look not just at texts, but at the medium itself. Writing materials shape how stories move. Clay tablets are heavy, fragile, and difficult to transport. Papyrus scrolls are light, portable, and easily copied. When scribes in the Levant adopted papyrus and ink, they effectively set the old flood myths free from the confines of temple libraries. What had been a local Mesopotamian epic could now travel along trade routes as compact bundles of language. The invention of alphabetic writing in the Levant also simplified transmission. Cuneiform required years of training. The new alphabets could be learned by anyone literate enough to run a small kingdom's administration. The flood left the realm of specialists and entered the realm of storytellers. There is evidence that by the early first millennium before the Common Era, fragments of Mesopotamian cosmology were already circulating among West Semitic cultures. The motif of divine council meetings, the concept of creation from watery chaos, and even the pairing of flood and mountain imagery appear in multiple texts from the region. Myths rarely migrate intact. They arrive as motifs, half-remembered echoes ready to be repurposed. By the time the Judean scribes began compiling their own creation and flood accounts, the idea of a deluge sent by divine decision would have felt both foreign and familiar. The Babylonian exile amplified this process. When a culture is displaced, it turns its trauma into theology. The destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of the temple forced the exiles to reinterpret history through catastrophe. The Mesopotamian flood myths provided a ready-made framework. a divine act of cleansing followed by renewal. But the exiled scribes did not simply copy what they found. They translated it through their own moral lens, one in which divine justice replaced divine rivalry, and ethical cause replaced divine noise. Yet before that synthesis could happen, the story had to cross a physical border, from clay to papyrus, from cuneiform to script, from Mesopotamia to the Levant. It is also worth noting that these transmissions were not purely one way. The Near East in the first millennium before the Common Era was a network of reciprocal influence. Egyptian theology borrowed Mesopotamian star lore. Hittite myths blended with Hurrian hymns. Phoenician sailors carried stories along the Mediterranean that would later resurface in Greek mythology. The flood narrative, in this sense, became part of a larger conversation about order, chaos, and renewal. When the story finally appears in Hebrew literature, it carries traces of all these voices. From an archaeological perspective, this diffusion is visible in the objects as much as the texts. Amulets, cylinder seals, and relief carvings depicting gods standing over waves or holding storm vases appear across the region. These were visual translations of the same idea, that water could both destroy and create, that survival depended on understanding the rhythm of the elements. The flood was not merely a tale, it was a worldview shaped by the environment of the Fertile Crescent, where rivers gave life and death in equal measure. To imagine the journey of this story is to picture generations of scribes copying and recopying, each adding a nuance, each adapting the language of power to the theology of survival. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia spoke in wedges, the papyrus scrolls of the Levant spoke in curves. Yet both carried the same pulse, the memory of a world almost lost. By the time the story reached its next incarnation, the stage was set. The gods had merged into one. The polyphonic debates of divine councils had condensed into a single voice. But that was still to come. For now, the flood remained a shared inheritance, a memory that crossed frontiers, outlived empires, and found new meaning wherever humans wondered why the world sometimes starts over. The scribes who carried it westward may not have known they were reshaping world history. They were simply writing what they had heard, recording whispers of an older world in a new script. What survived was not just a story, but a continuity of wonder, that the same flood once imagined in clay could later flow through ink and still make us ask where myth ends and memory begins. When most people read the story of the Great Flood in Genesis, they imagine a single seamless narrative, one God, one ark, one deluge, one human family preserved. But if you read slowly, listening not for belief but for texture, you begin to hear something strange. The story shifts in tone midstream. Some passages call the deity Yahweh, others Elohim. In one version the waters last 40 days, in another 150. In one account Noah brings 2 of every creature, in another 7 of each kind. It is not contradiction so much as counterpoint, 2 melodies interwoven in one song. The flood in Genesis, like the rivers that may have inspired it, has 2 currents flowing side by side. Scholars call these the J&P sources, short for Yahwist and priestly. They are among the most recognizable strands of what is known as the documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is a tapestry woven from earlier traditions. The Yahwist source is thought to have been written earlier, possibly during the era of the southern kingdom of Judah. Its language is earthy, narrative, and intimate. God walks, feels, regrets, and speaks directly. The priestly source, in contrast, was likely compiled later, during or after the Babylonian exile. It speaks in formal tones, preoccupied with order, measurement, and ritual. Where the Yahwist voice tells stories, the priestly voice keeps records. Together they produce the flood account we now know, a merged version that preserves both theology and structure, emotion and precision. The Yahwist account begins like an ancient folk story retold by a survivor. It describes divine sorrow and regret. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and the Lord regretted that he had made man. Here the divine is almost human in emotion, moved by grief, prone to change, capable of remorse. The flood is a response to corruption, not noise or overpopulation, as in earlier Mesopotamian myths. Yahweh decides to unmake what was made, to cleanse creation of its own conscience. But then, a human finds favour: Noah. In this early layer, Noah is chosen not because of cosmic destiny or ritual purity, but because of moral character. The Yahwist voice gives us a God who feels and a man who is noticed. The priestly voice begins differently. It does not weep or regret, it categorizes. The flood is described in engineering terms: cubits, decks, compartments, dimensions. This God, called Elohim in the text, acts not in anguish, but in calculation. The number of animals is specified, the duration of a rain is exact, and the sequence of rising and falling waters follows a pattern almost liturgical. It is less about destruction than recreation. The flood resets the world as a ritual of cosmic purification. In this version, Noah is not just a man. He is a priest presiding over the survival of life itself, the guardian of order in a universe threatened by chaos. For centuries, these two traditions were likely told separately, one in the storytelling circles of Judea, the other in the temple schools of exile. Only after Babylon's fall and the gradual return of the exiled scribes to Jerusalem were they woven together. The editor, or group of editors, who merged them did so with remarkable restraint. They did not erase the inconsistencies. They let both versions breathe. The result is not confusion but harmony, a text that carries both the intimacy of old oral myth and the discipline of priestly reform. It is a record of how theology itself evolved, how a personal, emotional god of the land became a universal, transcendent one of the heavens. What makes this fusion so compelling is how it preserves the memory of its making. You can still sense the editorial stitching, the way one verse bleeds into another from a different time, a different worldview. For example, in one passage Noah is instructed to take 2 of every animal. In another, 7 pairs of the clean animals and 2 of the unclean. The Yahwist writer likely lived in an era before priestly distinctions of ritual purity, while the priestly writer codified them into law. In merging the texts, the editor simply included both. The same layering occurs with the timeline of the flood. One voice says it rained 40 days and nights, a symbolic number, recurring later in wilderness narratives. The other specifies 150 days until the waters receded, anchoring the story in an almost astronomical rhythm of months and cycles. The editors did not reconcile. They allowed the contradictions to coexist, as if acknowledging that divine truth could contain more than one perspective. This duality reflects more than literary complexity. It mirrors the historical experience of the Jewish people during and after exile. The Yahwist source likely represents the theology of a settled kingdom, where God's presence was understood through the land, the harvest, and the temple. The priestly source, born in exile, reimagines divine order without geography. When your temple is gone, your faith has to migrate into language. The meticulous structure of the priestly text, its obsession with measurement, chronology, and classification, is not cold bureaucracy but a way of rebuilding the cosmos on paper. Through writing, exiles could restore the order that empire had destroyed. The flood story became a metaphor for both, the loss of an old world and the careful reconstruction of a new one. Reading Genesis with this awareness changes its rhythm. Suddenly, the story feels less like a divine monologue and more like a dialogue between generations. The Yahwist speaks from memory, the priest speaks from exile. The first remembers a world small enough for God to walk in. The second imagines a universe so vast that divine order must be written to be believed. The merging of these voices in one text marks one of the earliest examples of what we now call redaction, the conscious preservation of multiple traditions as a single whole. In an age when most cultures simplified myths into singular truths, the Hebrew editors did the opposite. They allowed dissonance to remain visible, perhaps as an act of faith that truth survives even when versions differ. Archaeological and linguistic evidence supports this idea of layered authorship. Differences in vocabulary, syntax, and divine naming align with the broader documentary hypothesis across the Pentateuch. The priestly material often uses formal genealogies, detailed measurements, and divine speech structured as commands. The Yahwist material favours narrative flow, anthropomorphic imagery, and emotional immediacy. In the flood account, these traits are interlaced line by line. To modern readers this might seem messy, but to ancient editors the coexistence of multiple voices was a mark of authenticity. The story was not rewritten to erase history, it was edited to remember it. What makes the Genesis flood unique among its ancient predecessors is not its plot, but its psychology. In Mesopotamian myths, divine conflict drives the narrative. The gods argue, regret, and compete. In Genesis, conflict moves inward. It is humanity's corruption that triggers catastrophe, not the quarrels of heaven. This moral shift reflects a deeper cultural change from mythic polytheism to ethical monotheism. Yet even here, the twin voices remain visible. One presents a god who feels sorrow. The other presents a god who acts through design. Together they form a portrait of divinity that is both emotional and ordered, capable of empathy and control. It is possible, too, that the redactor who combined these versions understood the symbolic power of dual perspective. By including both 40 days and 150, both pairs and sevens, both Yahweh and Elohim, the text mirrors the rhythm of flood and receding flood, destruction and renewal. The story is doubled in form because the world itself was doubled, made once, unmade, and made again. We do not know the name of the editor who performed this synthesis, but their work may be one of the most influential acts of storytelling in human history. By merging myth and theology, they created a model of layered truth that would later shape how scripture, philosophy, and even science approach the past. Not as singular revelation, but as accumulation. To them, preserving contradiction was not weakness, it was honesty. It was a way to say, this is how we remembered it, and how our ancestors remembered it too. When we read the flood story now, we're hearing not one voice but a conversation across centuries. It is a text that remembers its own making, a story about survival told by a people who had to survive the loss of everything familiar. The Ark, in this sense, is not just a vessel for animals, it is a vessel for language, carrying two traditions safely through the flood of time. In the age when myths began to take the form of measurement, the divine instructions for a vessel appeared in cubits. A boat, yes, but also a formula, a geometry of salvation. The Ark of Genesis is not a poem carved in clay like its Mesopotamian predecessors. It is a blueprint recited by a god who measures the flood. Here, myth and mathematics meet in the same breath. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. To ancient listeners, these were not abstract numbers. A cubit was the distance from elbow to fingertip, the measure of a human body, which means the Ark was defined not only by divine design, but by human proportion, a floating body built to the rhythm of the body itself. This is where the story begins to sound less mythic and more architectural. The description of Noah's Ark in Genesis is unlike anything else in the ancient world's flood literature. It is the only surviving flood story that treats the Ark as a project of structural engineering, down to its materials, dimensions and layout. 3 decks, a single door on the side, a roof raised 1 cubit above, and an exterior sealed with something called 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, a word that echoes across languages and centuries, whispering of its Mesopotamian ancestry. 𝐓𝐶𝐓 in Hebrew likely means bitumen or pitch, the dark tar-like substance used to waterproof ancient boats. But linguists have long noticed its resemblance to the Akkadian word 𝐓𝐶𝐓, the very same term used in the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh epics to describe the sealant on their flood vessels. Bitumen oozed naturally from the ground in parts of ancient Mesopotamia and was among humanity's earliest industrial materials. Archaeological layers at Ur, Kish and Eridu reveal that it was used to line canals, seal temple floors, and coat reed boats long before the first known flood stories were written. The biblical use of 𝐓𝐶𝐓 may be less a coincidence than a linguistic fossil, a small sticky trace of Mesopotamian technology preserved in Hebrew scripture. The same may be true for another word in the text, gopher wood. Scholars have debated its meaning for centuries because the term appears nowhere else in the Bible. Some argue it refers to a type of tree long lost to time. Others see it as a borrowed or corrupted word. A growing linguistic hypothesis suggests that gopher may be another echo of Akkadian craftsmanship, related to the root for KPR, the same one that gives us 𝐓𝐶𝐓. If true, this would mean the text's original intent may have been not a specific species of wood, but rather wood prepared with pitch, In other words, not gopher wood, but pitched wood. A functional description rather than a botanical one. It's the kind of subtle mistranslation that can turn an engineering note into a mystery. Even the Ark's rectangular design feels strangely practical, almost bureaucratic. Unlike earlier circular or cube-like flood vessels that symbolized completeness or divine symmetry, the Genesis Ark reads like a cargo barge, long, box-like utilitarian. Naval architects today have noted that its proportions, when converted to modern units, approximate those of a stable seafaring vessel. Too wide and it would roll, too tall and it would tip. 300 by 50 by 30 cubits produces a ratio close to that of large cargo ships in the industrial age. The biblical ark, if built to those specifications, would have been more stable than elegant, a floating chest rather than a boat with sails or oars. The Hebrew word for ark, teba, in fact means just that, a chest, a container. It appears only twice in the entire Hebrew Bible, once for Noah's Ark and once for the basket that carries infant Moses down the Nile. Both are vessels of preservation, not navigation. This distinction matters. The Ark is not a ship designed to reach a destination. It has no rudder, no oars, no pilot. It exists to endure, not to arrive. In this way, the Genesis story transforms the flood from a voyage into a vigil. Humanity does not sail through chaos, it simply survives it. And perhaps that is the quiet genius of the narrative. Earlier flood myths imagined survival as defiance, a human outsmarting the gods. The Hebrew version imagined survival as obedience, a human listening closely enough to measure what must be built. Archaeologists studying the text often note how the technical vocabulary of Genesis resembles the administrative language of the late Babylonian world, where scribes recorded temple inventories, land dimensions, and building materials with mathematical precision. It's likely that the exiled scribes who shaped the biblical account were themselves trained in this Mesopotamian style of record-keeping. For them, divine revelation might have sounded like a tablet being dictated. Length, width, height, materials, sequence, and closure. The sacred took the shape of a blueprint, but behind every measurement lies a story of transmission. How did a tale of reeds and pitch from Mesopotamia become a story of timber and covenant in Hebrew? Part of the answer may lie in geography. While Mesopotamian civilizations built with reeds because forests were scarce, the Levant was rich with cypress, cedar, and other tall hardwoods. Translating the flood story into a new landscape naturally replaced materials. What remained constant was the act of sealing, the human gesture of coating the vulnerable with protection. Whether reed or timber, the idea was the same. Survival requires separation from chaos, a membrane between life and the flood. The Ark's tripartite structure, its 3 decks, also reflects an enduring ancient pattern of cosmological order. Many Mesopotamian temples were divided into 3 vertical zones, symbolizing the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. The Ark's decks may mirror this microcosmic architecture, turning a boat into a miniature universe. When the floodwaters rise, this floating temple carries the essence of creation within it. Sky above, land in the middle, waters below. Every species becomes a worshipper, each pair a prayer. The Ark, in that sense, is not only an escape pod for life, but a portable cosmos, an ordered world adrift in disorder. The single door on the side of the Ark has been read symbolically for centuries. Some theologians interpret it as the narrow passage between mortality and salvation, but from an archaeological standpoint, it's an architectural necessity. A rectangular barge with internal decks could only be loaded from the side. The text's precision here suggests the writer knew what they were describing, or at least was borrowing from engineers who did. The 1-cubit roof opening too corresponds to ancient ventilation systems used in large storage barges along Near Eastern rivers. In other words, the Ark's specifications are not arbitrary numbers. They align with the physical logic of Bronze Age engineering. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this description is what it omits, any mention of how Noah actually built it. We are told of the measurements and the materials, but not the labour. In contrast to Mesopotamian epics, where craftsmen, family members and entire towns assist the hero, Genesis leaves Noah alone. The omission feels deliberate. The focus shifts from community to obedience, from human ingenuity to divine command. The ark is built in silence, by one man following instructions. The only sound, perhaps, the slow brush of pitch against wood. Some scholars see this as part of the larger priestly influence within Genesis, a worldview in which creation and recreation both occur through speech and structure. In the beginning, God speaks and measures light and darkness. In the flood, God measures again, rebuilding the cosmos from destruction. The ark's rectangular form, then, is less about nautical realism and more about theological geometry. It is the shape of order drawn against the chaos of the deep. Linguists studying the Hebrew term tabar have also pointed out its Egyptian resonance. In the story of Moses, the same word describes the small reed basket that protects the infant from the Nile. That basket too is sealed with pitch. The repetition of both word and material across two stories suggests that the ark was understood not only as an object, but as a category, the archetype of all things that float between life and death. Every T-bar is a boundary between worlds, carrying its contents toward renewal. When we look at the text through this lens, the ark becomes less a miracle and more a manual of survival. Its measurements are a metaphor for proportion, the balance between faith and practicality. To survive a flood, you need both. The divine blueprint gives numbers not to impress but to instruct. The cosmos, even in crisis, follows rules. The flood is chaos, but the ark is geometry, a reminder that understanding, however small, can keep us afloat. No archaeological evidence of such a vessel has ever been found, despite countless expeditions to mountains and deserts. Yet in a way, the ark's true survival lies not in wood but in language. It carried words across civilizations, from Akkadian to Hebrew, from myth to scripture, and in doing so, preserved the memory of our first engineers. They were not gods, only humans with reeds and tar, trying to make sense of a world that could drown without warning. When we look at the text through this lens, the ark becomes less a miracle and more a manual of survival. Its measurements are a metaphor for proportion, the balance between faith and practicality. To survive a flood, you need both. The divine blueprint gives numbers not to impress but to instruct. The cosmos, even in crisis, follows rules. The flood is chaos, but the ark is geometry, a reminder that understanding, however small, can keep us afloat. No archaeological evidence of such a vessel has ever been found, despite countless expeditions to mountains and deserts. Yet in a way, the ark's true survival lies not in wood, but in language. It carried words across civilizations, from Akkadian to Hebrew, from myth to scripture, and in doing so preserved the memory of our first engineers. They were not gods, only humans with reeds and tar, trying to make sense of a world that could drown without warning. In the end, the Genesis ark is less about divine miracle than human adaptation. It's a story written by people who had seen floods, lost homes, and learned that endurance sometimes begins with measurement. In a cosmos that once felt unpredictable, they imagined a god who gave instructions precise enough to hold against the tide. Whether or not it ever existed as a structure, it endures as an idea, that when the waters rise, order itself might be the only thing that floats. When ancient writers described a flood that covered the world, they were not simply describing water, they were describing a judgment. In the Genesis account, the rain that fell for 40 days was not just weather, it was ethics in motion, a divine response to human behaviour. The world did not drown because it was noisy or overpopulated. It drowned because it had forgotten how to be human. For the first time in written mythology, a flood was not caused by divine annoyance but by moral failure. The sky did not open for thunder. It opened for conscience. The text of Genesis presents this shift in a single, quiet observation. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. The story begins not with noise or rebellion, but with imagination, thoughts themselves becoming corrupted. That is where morality enters the flood story. Sin is no longer something done, it is something thought, and in that small narrative turn, the flood ceases to be a storm and becomes a diagnosis. To understand this transformation, we have to step inside the mindset of its authors. The people who shaped Genesis lived in a world where natural disasters were constant reminders of human vulnerability. Floods along the Tigris, Euphrates and Jordan valleys could destroy entire settlements overnight. But to describe such devastation as moral judgment was not a scientific error. It was a way of giving meaning to survival. If the world could vanish in an instant, perhaps the reason lay not in the river but in the heart. The flood narrative turned catastrophe into reflection. It made ethics cosmological. The choice of 40 days and 40 nights is not arbitrary either. In the Hebrew imagination, 40 became a number of transformation, a symbolic duration of testing. It appears again and again throughout Scripture. 40 years in the desert, 40 days of fasting, 40 days of revelation. It marks the span between destruction and renewal, death and rebirth. In the flood story, those 40 days become the moral quarantine of the human species. The world is submerged not to be erased, but to be cleansed of its violence. Water becomes the medium through which morality resets itself. The word that defines Noah in this story is not hero but righteous. The Hebrew term tzaddik carries a sense of ethical alignment, not perfection. Noah is not portrayed as flawless, only as obedient enough to listen. That listening becomes the moral hinge of the entire narrative. When God says, "Make for yourself an ark," Noah does not question or negotiate. He acts. This obedience, quiet and unadorned, becomes the new measure of goodness. In a world where wickedness is described as imagination gone astray, righteousness is portrayed as attention restored. To obey is to hear clearly again. In earlier myths, survival depended on cleverness. The hero outwits the gods, builds a boat in secret, tricks fate. In Genesis, survival depends on trust. Noah's virtue lies not in innovation but in surrender. The divine plan is not debated, it is followed to the cubit. And within that obedience, a new kind of relationship emerges, one between conscience and cosmos. The flood, for all its terror, becomes the first story of moral clarity. It asks not how to survive disaster, but why some people do. The text's moral language is strikingly psychological. Every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was evil. The heart, in ancient Hebrew thought, was not a symbol of emotion but of will and reasoning. To say that human hearts were corrupt meant that the very faculty of decision-making, the part that distinguishes choice from impulse, had decayed. The flood then becomes a divine reformation of decision itself. Creation is remade not by altering matter, but by cleansing intention. Noah's story is brief in dialogue but heavy in action. While the narrative gives us detailed engineering specifications, it gives us almost nothing of his inner life. We do not hear his doubts or fears. The silence of Noah is intentional. He becomes less a character and more a mirror. His stillness stands against the chaos of the world around him, a moral equilibrium amid rising disorder. The flood narrative thus contrasts noise and silence. The world drowns in the noise of corruption, while the one who listens in silence survives. The text's emphasis on righteousness has often been misunderstood as reward, but in Genesis righteousness is not transactional. Noah is not spared because he is righteous because he listens. The flood is not about punishment versus reward, it is about pattern versus interruption. The world falls into the pattern of evil, imagination without restraint. Noah interrupts that pattern through attention, through aligning his will with something larger than himself. That is why his story, unlike earlier flood survivors, ends with a covenant rather than immortality. The lesson is not how to live forever, but how to live rightly. The 40 days of rain can also be read as symbolic inversion of creation. In the opening verses of Genesis, the world begins as water, the deep, the Tehom, and God separates the waters above from the waters below to create space for life. In the flood, those boundaries collapse. The waters rejoin, creation uncreates itself, yet within that undoing, order is preserved inside the ark. It floats as a microcosm of moral structure. Every pair of animals, every family member, each detail of organisation echoes the balance that the outer world lost. The ark is a moral prototype, the memory of creation kept intact while chaos reigns. What happens when the flood ends is equally significant. When the waters recede, God looks upon the world and makes a covenant never to destroy it again. This promise introduces a new dimension of divine self-limitation. a concept rare in ancient theology. The deity binds itself to mercy. It is a remarkable moral evolution. The power to destroy becomes the decision not to, and from that restraint emerges the rainbow, a symbol not just of beauty but of agreement, a bow set aside, unstrung. The universe, it seems, has learned compassion. The shift from flood as punishment to flood as renewal also signals a new understanding of humanity's role in the moral order. In Genesis, humankind is no longer incidental to divine plans. Our behaviour can alter cosmic equilibrium. The moral world and the physical world become reflections of one another. When one decays, the other collapses. This idea, radical for its time, laid the groundwork for thousands of years of ethical cosmology. The universe itself becomes participatory, its stability dependent on moral alignment. The phrase, "every living thing," repeats throughout the flood narrative, reminding readers that this is not just a human story. The moral arc of the text extends beyond people to animals, land, and even air. The flood destroys indiscriminately, but the covenant that follows includes all life. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. It is the first universal treaty in literature, one that binds not nations but species. The moral horizon has expanded from personal sin to ecological empathy. To survive is to coexist. There is a quiet irony at the heart of this story. A text so full of destruction becomes the foundation of moral continuity. It teaches that survival alone is not victory. Survival must mean transformation. The flood cleans the world, but it also cleans the concept of justice itself. Divine wrath becomes self-aware. Power learns compassion. Humanity, for all its flaws, becomes capable of moral learning. That is why the story ends not in triumph, but in reflection. A world washed, not perfected. And in this sense, the flood never really ends. It becomes a metaphor that resurfaces whenever humanity faces its own destructiveness. Every culture that inherits this narrative transforms it into a question. What are we drowning in now? Water, or ourselves? The answer changes with time, but the current remains the same. The flood is the moment when ethics became a survival skill. As a story, the flood invites awe. As a moral experiment, it invites humility. It asks us to remember that every act of creation contains the capacity for uncreation, and that every measurement of cubits, of rain, of days, is also a measure of conscience. The water may have receded, but the moral tide still rises and falls with us. When the floodwaters finally begin to sink beneath the horizon, the world is still without sound. The ark creaks, the air hangs heavy with salt and decay, and the line between life and death remains uncertain. It is in this silence that Noah opens a small window and releases a bird. For days the dove circles above the waters, searching for anything green. When it returns at dusk, it carries in its beak a single olive leaf, fresh, bright, alive. That small leaf, fragile as breath, becomes one of the most enduring symbols in human history. It means the storm has passed. It means the earth has not forgotten how to grow, and it means that, somehow, life has forgiven us again. In the ancient text, this moment lasts only a sentence, but its resonance crosses civilizations. The olive branch appears later in Greek art, Roman coins, Hebrew psalms, Christian scripture, and even on the modern emblem of the United Nations. The dove carrying an olive leaf is older than peace treaties, older than diplomacy. It is the first recorded image of reconciliation between humanity and the world itself. Before there were flags or borders, there was a bird returning to a window carrying proof that the flood had an end. To understand why this image has survived for more than 4 millennia, we have to look not at theology, but at ecology. The olive tree, Olea europaea, is native to the eastern Mediterranean. It thrives in hard soil, in heat and drought, where most other trees surrender. But what makes it extraordinary is its resilience to disaster. Even if the trunk burns or is cut down, its roots can sprout again from the base. In the Levant, where the Genesis story was first told, people knew the olive tree not as fragile but as immortal. To find its leaf after a flood meant that the land had endured. The tree's roots had waited under water for weeks, and the moment the soil dried, they breathed again. The olive leaf was not only a sign of peace, it was proof of survival. The raven, released before the dove, tells the other half of the story. In ancient Near Eastern symbolism, ravens were carrion birds, scavengers associated with death and decay. When Noah sends out the raven, it does not return. It finds sustenance in the corpses left by the flood. The dove, by contrast, is a seed-eater, a creature that depends on living vegetation. Its return means life has re-emerged. In this pairing, the raven and the dove become twin instruments of observation. One confirms that death still exists, the other that life has begun again. Between them lies the boundary between judgment and mercy. The image of the dove was not chosen for its purity but for its behaviour. Doves and pigeons, which are close relatives, were domesticated early in the Near East and were known for their ability to find their way home over great distances. For farmers and herders, the sight of a dove returning at sunset was as ordinary as it was comforting. It meant stability. The Genesis writer may have known this, and so the dove's return to the ark becomes a metaphor for the world returning to order. It is the same logic later seen in the Hebrew prophets, where the return of birds each season becomes a sign that creation still keeps its rhythm. The olive tree carried similar meaning in the landscape of ancient Israel. Its fruit provided not only food but light. Olive oil burned in lamps that illuminated homes and temples alike. To the people of that region, the olive was civilization itself. Sustenance, commerce, and worship all drawn from one tree. Archaeological evidence shows olive cultivation across the Levant as early as 6,000 years before the Common Era. Charred olive pits from ancient Jericho and coastal Syria show that the plant was already central to the economy and daily life. The appearance of the olive leaf in the flood story, therefore, is not random poetic detail. It is the symbol of homecoming, of culture restored after chaos. From a literary perspective, the simplicity of the gesture is what makes it profound. No divine proclamation announces the end of the flood. No trumpet sounds from heaven. Instead, a bird returns carrying a leaf. It is nature itself that speaks first, not the voice of God. In that moment, revelation passes from heaven to earth. The human being learns from a bird that the world is ready again. This motif, the natural sign of divine favour, spread far beyond the Hebrew tradition. In ancient Greece, the olive was sacred to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and peace. According to myth, she gifted the tree to humanity, and from that moment it became the emblem of both enlightenment and stability. Greek city-states crowned victors with olive wreaths not as symbols of conquest, but of harmony, of strength restrained. Rome inherited this association and carried it into imperial imagery, where an olive branch held by the goddess Pax symbolized the peace that followed war. When early Christian artists adapted the Noah story for catacomb frescoes, they placed the dove in Christ's hand, replacing the old flood with the new covenant. The same image would later adorn Renaissance altarpieces, papal seals, and the banners of peace movements. What began as an agricultural sign in a floodplain became the universal shorthand for reconciliation. There is also a quieter biological truth behind the symbol. Olive leaves are thick, coated with a waxy layer that resists water. This makes them float and remain intact long after being detached from the branch. For the storytellers who lived in the land of olives, this detail would have been observed, not invented. The leaf Noah receives could very well have been carried by flood currents from a surviving grove on higher ground. Its realism anchors its symbolism. The miracle of the olive leaf is that it belongs equally to nature and to metaphor. When we examine the flood story through this lens, the dove's flight becomes the first act of fieldwork in human literature. Noah sends out an observer to collect data, and the evidence it brings back changes human understanding of the world. The olive leaf is both empirical and spiritual proof. It says, the water level has dropped, photosynthesis has resumed, the soil can breathe. But it also says, forgiveness has taken root. This blending of observation and meaning is precisely what defines the worldview of the ancient writers. They did not separate science from faith, symbol from fact. Every event was both. The olive branch would continue to evolve as a symbol, often detached from its original context. In the Hebrew prophets, it becomes a metaphor for Israel itself, a living branch that can be pruned or grafted but not destroyed. In the Psalms, children are compared to olive shoots around a table, a poetic image of continuity. Later, in the Gospel narratives, a dove descending at Jesus' baptism reappears as the emblem of divine presence, merging the flood's promise with a new kind of peace, internal rather than environmental. And in modern times, when the United Nations adopted the olive wreath as its emblem, it was an unconscious return to the earliest meaning, humanity once again trying to survive its own flood. If we step back from symbolism and imagine the scene as an archaeologist might, it is humbling. A wooden vessel adrift on a vast inland sea. A small window cut into the upper deck. The old man releasing a bird that disappears into grey. And then, after days of silence, a soft beating of wings. The return of something green. The entire civilization, all its fears and memories, distilled into the trembling of a leaf. It is perhaps the oldest environmental report in human history, delivered not by words but by instinct. The endurance of this image reveals something about us as a species. We're always waiting for the dove. Every generation imagines its own flood, wars, plagues, fires, extinctions, and every generation hopes for the sign that life has survived. The olive branch endures because it speaks to that universal cycle of despair and renewal. It tells us that peace is not imposed by decree but grown back from the soil, one leaf at a time. And so the dove's flight, recorded in a few brief lines thousands of years ago, continues to circle over us. It appears on coins, flags, and children's drawings, carrying the same message across ages, that peace is not the absence of chaos, but its transformation. Somewhere in the earliest human memory, a window opened, a bird flew out, and when it returned, the world exhaled. When the rains finally stopped and the sky began to open, the story could have ended there, with dry ground, clean air and relief. But Genesis does something unexpected. It does not close the flood story with survival, it closes it with a promise. When Noah steps onto the new earth, the text says that God set a bow in the clouds as a sign of covenant, a word that would go on to define not just the rest of the Bible, but the moral imagination of an entire civilization. The flood is no longer only about punishment or rescue. It becomes about agreement, about restraint, about the relationship between a creator and creation after catastrophe. And the symbol chosen for that agreement, a rainbow, is one of the oldest and most universal bridges between fear and beauty. In the ancient world, a rainbow was not a comforting image. It was a weapon. The bow, curved and silent, was the symbol of the warrior's power. In the Hebrew text, the word used, keshet, means both rainbow and warbow. To set the bow in the clouds meant to hang up one's weapon, to end hostility. The divine warrior disarms. The world is no longer a battlefield. This is perhaps the earliest recorded image of cosmic demilitarization. The idea that creation itself is not something to be subdued again, but something to be sustained. The covenant that follows is strikingly inclusive. It does not involve a chosen people, a temple or a ritual. It is not between God and a nation, or God and a king. It is between God and every living creature, with the earth itself listed as witness. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. The phrase is simple, but the concept is enormous. For the first time, divine responsibility is extended beyond humanity to all forms of life. In the moral landscape of Genesis, this is the moment ecology begins. The planet, the animals, the weather, and the moral behaviour of humans are all woven into a single moral system. It is not science, but it is the beginning of the idea that nature has memory, that the state of the world mirrors the state of human conscience. The rainbow, therefore, is not just an aesthetic flourish at the end of a storm, it is a visual theology. It takes something natural and makes it ethical. Its appearance depends on both light and water, the same two elements that defined creation and flood alike. Light refracts through droplets of water to create colour. In this physics, the text finds symbolism. The very forces that once destroyed the earth now become the medium of its promise. The rainbow is the reconciliation of destruction and creation. It is the cosmos remembering mercy. What makes this so powerful is how quiet it is. The covenant does not come as a decree carved in stone or as thunder from heaven. It appears as light bending through air, silent, fleeting, observable by anyone. It is theology reduced to physics and then re-expanded into faith. Anyone who sees it, even without words, can understand the meaning. The storm can end. The world can begin again. The ethics embedded in this covenant are also revolutionary. The flood story redefines divine justice not as unrestrained power, but as self-restraint. The deity binds itself with a condition. In a universe where gods were typically agents of unpredictable force, this was an innovation. The divine now possesses the moral capacity to limit its own violence. To promise not to destroy is, paradoxically, the highest form of power, the power of choice. The rainbow becomes the symbol of voluntary restraint. For the human side of the covenant, the responsibility is implicit. Though the text focuses on divine mercy, it also reminds us that the world's survival is tied to human behaviour. The flood was not random, it was the result of corruption and violence. The covenant implies that if such corruption returns, the danger will not come from heaven, but from ourselves. The rainbow is the visual reminder that destruction is no longer divine but human in origin. The burden of preservation now belongs to us. Archaeological evidence suggests that the regions described in Genesis, the floodplains of the Near East, were particularly vulnerable to environmental collapse. Over-farming, deforestation, and irrigation shifts could cause floods, droughts, and famine in alternating cycles. For ancient writers, these patterns were not yet seen as ecological systems, but as moral cycles. When the land suffered, so had the people. When the people repented, the land revived. The covenantal worldview captures this pattern, merging morality with sustainability long before the language of ecology existed. It is a Bronze Age recognition that the earth and its inhabitants are codependent. The rainbow also marks a change in the relationship between heaven and earth. Before the flood, divine-human interaction was direct, often violent and emotional. Creation, punishment, expulsion. After the flood, it becomes contractual, symbolic, based on signs and covenants rather than interventions. The rainbow is the first natural phenomenon elevated to a permanent divine signature. Every time it appears, the promise renews itself without words. The text even says that when God sees the rainbow, God remembers the covenant. Not us remembering God, but God remembering us. It is as though the universe itself carries reminders of its moral agreements. In later theological traditions, this moment would be seen as the prototype for all other covenants, the beginning of the moral dialogue that continues through Abraham, Moses, and beyond. But the flood covenant is unique because it asks for no ritual, no temple, no sacrifice. It requires only recognition. To look at the sky after a storm and understand that survival carries responsibility. There is a scientific beauty in how this aligns with human psychology. Modern studies show that witnessing natural renewal, the clearing after rain, the return of sunlight, the appearance of colour, can evoke deep emotional release. Ancient authors encoded this feeling into narrative form. The rainbow is not only divine sign but emotional closure. It represents the neurological relief after fear, the shift from cortisol to calm. In mythological language, that relief becomes covenant. The rainbow's 7 colours, a later cultural observation, came to represent completeness, a visual spectrum bridging extremes. To ancient observers, the spectrum was seamless, without clear boundaries, just as the covenant itself had no exclusions. All creation participates in it simply by existing. In art and literature across centuries, the rainbow remains a symbol of inclusion, continuity and hope, precisely because it began as the opposite of destruction. Even outside religion, the image holds power. For scientists, it demonstrates the harmony of physical laws. For poets, it embodies transience. For activists, it represents diversity and coexistence. The rainbow continues to mean what it first meant, that difference can exist within unity, that colour can emerge from storm, that light and water, once enemies, can coexist. When read in this context, the flood story ends not with despair, but with an ecological revelation. Humanity, the animals, the land and the sky are bound together by a shared promise. The divine role shifts from enforcer to guarantor. The moral of the flood is no longer about guilt, it is about responsibility. The rainbow is not the end of wrath, but the beginning of ethics. It's remarkable that such a simple meteorological event could carry so much meaning. But perhaps that is why it endures. Anyone who has stood in the aftermath of a storm and seen a rainbow has felt, even for a moment, the ancient relief it represents, that the destruction has limits, that beauty can follow fear. The science behind it is universal. The feeling it evokes is timeless. Maybe that is why the text ends not with a command but with a reminder. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. In that line, theology achieves humility. Even the divine needs reminders. The world remains fragile, storms will return, but the rainbow tells us that fragility itself can be sacred, that survival, however temporary, is worth promising again and again. Could there have been a real flood beneath the stories? An event so catastrophic that it imprinted itself on the memory of a species? To archaeologists, this question is less about proving myth and more about decoding memory. Every river tells a story, and some of those stories end suddenly in layers of mud. Somewhere between 7,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era, the world's first civilizations rose where water was both a blessing and a threat, along the low, flat floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates. This was not a gentle landscape. These rivers, fed by snowmelt from distant mountains, could rise without warning, overtopping their banks, swallowing fields, homes and lives. To live there was to live in the constant presence of both fertility and annihilation. And it is within this geography that scientists have looked for traces of the flood that could have inspired the earliest written deluge stories. The idea of a real flood gained momentum in the 20th century, when archaeologists began noticing thick layers of a river silt, separating older settlement layers at several Mesopotamian sites. In the 1920s, Leonard Woolley excavated at Ur, the ancient Sumerian city that would later produce the famous royal tombs. Beneath those layers, he found a band of clean water-laid clay, almost 3 meters thick, separating earlier habitation debris from later occupation. The layer contained no artifacts, no bricks, no pottery, just sterile mud. To Woolley, it looked exactly like the residue of a massive inundation. He famously announced that he had found Noah's flood. But as more sites were excavated, the story became more complicated. Similar flood layers were found at Shuruppak, Kish and Uruk, but not at the same depths or the same periods. The floods were local, not universal. Each city bore scars from its own catastrophe. The plains, it turned out, had not been wiped clean once, but many times. Geologists now understand that the Mesopotamian alluvial plain was shaped by thousands of years of shifting river courses, seasonal floods, and sudden breaches of ancient levees. Because the region sits between 2 large rivers that carry sediment from hundreds of kilometres away, the landscape literally moves over time. A settlement that once sat on high ground could be buried by silt within a few generations. When we read the earliest flood stories, we are hearing the mythology of sediment. A flood might not have covered the world, but it could have erased the world that people knew. Still, some scientists have searched for a more singular event, a disaster large enough to echo across generations. One of the most discussed candidates is the so-called Black Sea flood hypothesis. In the late 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that around 7,000 years before the Common Era, rising global sea levels caused the Mediterranean to burst through the Bosporus Strait, catastrophically flooding what had been a vast freshwater lake. They suggested that the shoreline could have advanced hundreds of meters per day, displacing early farming communities and transforming the region into the saltwater Black Sea we know today. To the people living there, it would have felt like the sea itself had risen up to devour the land. The theory captured the public imagination because it seemed to fit the shape of the myth, a sudden, world-ending deluge followed by human migration. But later research complicated that too. Core samples from the Black Sea floor revealed that while there was indeed a dramatic change from fresh water to marine sediments, the transition may have been more gradual, perhaps a series of surges rather than a single overwhelming flood. Radiocarbon dates also showed that the event's timing did not line up neatly with the earliest Mesopotamian flood layers. If anything, it reminded researchers that floods large enough to reshape coastlines were not rare in the early Holocene world. Melting glaciers and rising seas had been drowning continental shelves for millennia. The world was literally still settling after the last ice age, and humans were living through the slow chaos of it. In southern Mesopotamia, floods may have been triggered not by oceans, but by rainfall patterns shifting under changing climates. Paleoclimate data from lake cores and stalagmites show that the Near East experienced abrupt wet and dry cycles during the early Holocene. Periods of heavy monsoon activity could have produced floods that would devastate the flat deltic terrain of ancient Sumer. When rivers overtopped their banks, the water had nowhere to go but out, spreading over kilometres of low-lying farmland before receding and leaving behind fertile silt. For ancient farmers, this cycle of destruction and renewal would have been both terrifying and essential. Over time, the rhythm of the rivers became the rhythm of civilization, but occasionally that rhythm broke, and the destruction outweighed the renewal. Those breaks may be the true fossils of myth. In this light, the flood stories of Mesopotamia begin to look less like memories of a single disaster, and more like cultural responses to living in a land constantly rewritten by water. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians all lived within the reach of unpredictable floods. Their cities relied on canals, levees, and irrigation ditches, a fragile infrastructure that required constant maintenance. When a dike broke or a season of storms overwhelmed the system, it would have felt cosmic, moral, inevitable. Archaeology has revealed multiple flood strata in cities along the Euphrates Valley, each separated by centuries, sometimes longer. A flood layer around 3,000 years before the Common Era at Shuruppak, for instance, roughly corresponds to the period when the earliest written flood myths appear. That coincidence may not prove cause and effect, but it shows that myth and mud once met. Beyond Mesopotamia, geologists have identified similar traces in other regions, evidence of catastrophic flooding in the Indus Valley, along the Nile, and around the Persian Gulf. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, rapid sea level rise transformed vast coastal plains into seabeds, displacing populations that had lived there for millennia. In that sense, the world that drowned was literal, the familiar coastal world of early humans. To those living through it, there was no distinction between mythic and geological scale. A flood that swallowed their horizon was as good as universal. What makes this question difficult is that floods leave ambiguous traces. A layer of sediment can be deposited by a local river flood, a storm surge, or a shifting delta, and without datable artifacts it is hard to tell which is which. But the power of the myth lies precisely in that ambiguity. The flood was not remembered as an event that happened once. It was remembered as something that could always happen again. In the collective memory of the ancient Near East, the flood was the reset button of creation, the line that could be crossed and redrawn endlessly. In recent decades, sediment cores and isotopic data have helped reconstruct regional flood histories with far more detail. Some models suggest that around 5,000 years before the Common Era, there was an especially severe flooding phase in the Mesopotamian basin, possibly linked to a shift in monsoon intensity. Others propose that tectonic subsidence in the delta region periodically lowered the land, making even moderate floods catastrophic. Whatever the mechanism, the evidence suggests that floods of regional magnitude occurred frequently enough to become foundational in cultural memory. Myths fossilize repetition. One of the most compelling things about studying these ancient flood layers is realizing how fragile human civilization has always been in the face of climate variability. The same water that allowed agriculture and writing to flourish could, in a single season, erase entire settlements. For people who had only just begun to record their history on clay, to see those same tablets buried in mud must have felt like the gods themselves rewriting their words. The flood was not only an event, it was an existential metaphor for human impermanence. And perhaps this is why the story endures. The science does not disprove the myth, it reframes it. The flood may not have covered the earth, but it did cover the only world those people knew, the flat, fertile expanse that had nurtured their first cities and their earliest words. To lose that world would have been, to them, nothing less than the end of everything. In the end, what the sediment and the stories share is a kind of humility. The mud at Ur, the clay at Shuruppak, the salt at the bottom of the Black Sea, all speak the same truth, that the earth remembers what we forget. Our ancestors did not invent the flood out of nothing. They watched it happen again and again until it became part of their definition of existence. Whether caused by melting ice, shifting rivers, or rising seas, The great floods of prehistory taught humans a lesson we are still relearning, that civilization is always temporary, and that the forces that create it can just as easily take it away. So, could there have been a flood beneath the myth? Almost certainly, many of them. But each layer of silt tells a smaller, more human story, not of global destruction, but of survival, rebuilding, and the fragile hope that memory itself can outlast the water. Across the world, in stories separated by oceans, languages, and millennia, there is one moment that nearly every ancient culture remembered. The time when the waters rose and did not stop. The details shift like the tide. Sometimes a god sends the storm. Sometimes it is the earth itself that breaks open. But the shape of the story remains strangely familiar. A righteous man, a warning, a boat, a flood, a beginning again. For centuries, scholars treated these resemblances as coincidence or cultural borrowing. But a quieter theory has taken hold in recent years, one less about diffusion than about memory. Maybe the reason every civilization remembered a flood is that every coastline truly saw one. Long before satellites or seawalls, humanity's first settlements clung to shorelines, rivers and deltas, the same places most vulnerable to the climatic instability that followed the last ice age. Between about 12,000 and 7,000 years before the Common Era, melting glaciers drove sea levels upward by more than 100 metres, redrawing every map on Earth. Valleys became bays, islands became peninsulas, coastal plains that had sheltered Paleolithic communities disappeared beneath rising seas. For people who measured the world by the horizon, to watch that horizon drown would have felt cosmic. And so, wherever humans settled, they told the same story in the language of their gods, that the world had once been washed clean. In ancient Greece, the tale belonged to Deucalion and Pyrrha. According to Hesiod and later writers, Zeus decided to end the Age of Bronze by unleashing a flood that would wipe humankind away. Only Deucalion, son of the wise Prometheus, was warned in time. He built a wooden chest, not unlike the arks of Mesopotamia, and took refuge with his wife as the waters engulfed the earth for 9 days. When their vessel finally came to rest on Mount Parnassus, the couple offered sacrifices to the gods. At Zeus's command, they repopulated the world by casting stones over their shoulders. Those thrown by Deucalion became men, those thrown by Pyrrha became women. It is an origin myth wrapped inside a survival story, and its moral is gentler than most. Humanity, this version suggests, is literally born from the bones of the earth, a reminder that even in destruction, the world itself remains fertile. Far to the east, in the hymns of India's early Vedic tradition, another survivor awaited his flood. The story of Manu, preserved in the Shatapatha Brahmana and later the Mahabharata, begins not with wrath but with gratitude. A small fish pleads for protection, warning Manu that a great deluge is coming. As the fish grows, it reveals itself as the god Vishnu in disguise. The deity instructs Manu to build a massive boat and gather the seeds of every living thing. When the waters rise, the divine fish, now colossal, tows the vessel to safety, mooring it atop the northern mountains. After the flood, Manu performs a ritual offering, and from it emerges a woman with whom he begins the next age of humanity. Here, the flood is not punishment, but purification, a reset of the cosmic cycle that transforms chaos into order once more. The pattern continues in China, where ancient texts tell of the great flood and the hero Yu, who conquered the waters not with divine rescue but with engineering. The story appears in early dynastic chronicles such as the Book of Documents and the records of the Grand Historian. According to legend, the world was once submerged for years, with torrents pouring from the sky and rivers overflowing their banks. The gods appointed Gun to stop it, but his efforts failed. His son Yu succeeded by dredging channels and guiding the floodwaters back to the sea, creating the river system that nourished Chinese civilization. The moral is strikingly practical. Instead of divine deliverance, it celebrates human perseverance, an ancient recognition that survival sometimes depends not on being spared, but on adapting. Across the ocean, the peoples of Mesoamerica told their own versions of the Deluge. In Aztec myth, the gods destroyed the fourth sun, the fourth creation of the world, with water. Only one man and one woman survived by taking refuge in the hollow trunk of a great tree. When they descended, they cooked fish in defiance of the gods and were transformed into dogs, an echo of divine punishment for overstepping cosmic order. The Maya, too, remembered floods that marked the end of ages. In the Popol Vuh, the gods send rain and resin to wash away an earlier race of wooden people whose hearts lacked emotion. It is both apocalyptic and moral, a reminder that creation and destruction are simply chapters in the same book. Even in the Pacific, among Polynesian navigators, flood stories float between the islands like driftwood. Tales of gods who overturn the world and ancestors who survive on canoes, their memory carried across oceans. Among indigenous peoples of North America, from the Hopi to the Haida, the earth is often remade by water, and survival depends on cooperation with the animals or spirits who help humanity begin again. In nearly all these traditions, the flood is not just an event, it is a mirror reflecting human frailty, resilience, and the belief that life must sometimes be cleansed to continue. The repetition is eerie. Myths separated by continents still share motifs so specific. A chosen survivor, a floating refuge, the replanting of life, that they seem to trace back to something deeper than chance. Cultural contact cannot explain it all. Greek sailors did not trade stories with the Maya, nor did Vedic priests hear of Yu's canals. What links them may be psychological as much as historical, a shared response to environmental trauma. Psychologists studying collective memory have proposed that certain catastrophic experiences leave enduring imprints on group identity, transmitted through story, ritual, and metaphor. For early humans, few experiences were as viscerally traumatic as watching the world drown. When entire landscapes vanished, coastlines, river valleys, even the fertile shallows where their ancestors had hunted, the survivors did what humans do best. They made meaning. Over generations, memory transformed into myth, and myth into cosmology. The flood became not just a record of disaster, but a philosophy about renewal. In this sense, the global flood tradition functions less as a literal chronicle, and more as a psychological constant, the story of instability told by a species craving permanence. Anthropologists note that many deluge myths arise in regions with long histories of seasonal inundation or tectonic volatility, deltaic plains, monsoon basins, volcanic coasts. The story is not only about water, but about living at the edge of change. Each culture shaped the flood into its own reflection. The Greeks made it moral, the Indians cyclical, the Chinese civilizational, the Mesoamericans cosmic. But the rhythm remained the same: destruction, survival, regeneration. Archaeology increasingly supports the notion that early Holocene communities worldwide faced sudden, local cataclysms large enough to imprint themselves on cultural memory. Around the time Greek myths were taking form, for instance, the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean coastlines were still adjusting to rising seas. In southern Asia, monsoon patterns fluctuated dramatically, sometimes submerging river basins for years. In China, evidence of widespread flooding from the Yellow River corresponds roughly with the legendary timeline of Yu. Even in the Americas, geological layers reveal episodes of massive flooding associated with glacial outbursts or seismic shifts. Each might have spawned its own version of the same story. And yet, the universality of these myths also says something about human imagination. To early storytellers, water was both creator and destroyer, the ultimate equalizer. It dissolved hierarchies, erased boundaries, and left behind only those who could remember. That duality gave rise to a kind of humility, the understanding that civilization rests on borrowed time. The flood stories of the world are not warnings of divine wrath, they are confessions of vulnerability. Modern science, in a way, has brought us full circle. We now know that the ancient world was indeed shaped by floods beyond anything written. The melting of ice sheets raised oceans globally, river valleys drowned, entire ecosystems shifted. What myth preserved as moral allegory, geology confirms as climate event. The difference is only in tone. Where myth saw divine correction, science sees hydrology and orbit. But both share the same awe, that life on Earth depends on forces vast enough to unmake it. And so we are left with this strange convergence that nearly every civilization in isolation remembered water as the measure of all things. The flood is our oldest metaphor because it is also our oldest fear. It reminds us that no wall, no empire, no text lasts forever. Only the current moves on. If there is something comforting in these repetitions, it is that they bind us together across time. The same human voice that told of Deucalion's chest, of Manu's boat, of Yu's channels and the Maya's rain still speaks in us, trying to make sense of a world that never stays dry for long. Maybe in that way, the flood never ended. It simply moved inward, into the tides of memory. In the 19th century, a strange word began to echo through lecture halls, museum basements, and dig sites carved into the deserts of the Near East: Antediluvian. It meant, quite literally, before the flood. For theologians, it described the world that had supposedly existed between creation and the deluge of Noah. But for a new generation of archaeologists, it became a metaphor for something larger: the deep, uncharted prehistory that lay buried beneath the ground, waiting to be read like scripture written in clay. The age of spades and tablets had begun, and humanity was about to meet its own forgotten story face to face. The 19th century was an era intoxicated by discovery. Fossils were rewriting the history of life. Ancient bones hinted that humanity had walked the earth long before the Bible said it should. Steamships carried scholars from London and Paris to the crumbling ziggurats of Mesopotamia, where entire civilizations had lain hidden under dust for thousands of years. When they arrived, they found not a myth but an archive, a library of broken tablets whose wedge-shaped script would soon speak louder than any sermon. At the heart of this new revelation stood a quiet British engraver named George Smith. He was not an academic nor a priest. He worked at the British Museum, repairing antiquities and cleaning clay fragments collected from Assyrian ruins. But Smith had an unusual gift. He could read cuneiform, the world's oldest writing, with a precision that baffled even his superiors. Day after day, surrounded by shelves of cracked clay, he began piecing together fragments of ancient stories, scraps of myth that hinted at gods, kings, and a flood. Then, in the winter of 1872, Smith found it. Among the tablets excavated from the library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, he uncovered a passage written in Akkadian, a language dead for more than 2,000 years, that spoke of a righteous man who built a boat to survive a divine flood. The world, it said, had been washed clean by the gods, and life had begun anew. It was the 11th tablet of what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh, though at the time Smith simply knew it as the Chaldean account of the Deluge. When he first read the words aloud, the story goes, he leapt from his chair, ran around the room, and tore off his clothes in excitement. Victorian decorum aside, his astonishment was justified. The clay in his hands seemed to confirm that the biblical flood was not unique, that a far older story, written a millennium before Moses, told of the same destruction and survival. For a public raised on scripture, this was either thrilling or terrifying. The newspapers printed it as if the earth itself had spoken. The discovery made Smith famous overnight. The Daily Telegraph, captivated by his find, funded an expedition to Mesopotamia so he could search for the missing pieces of the flood story. The British Museum sent him east, back to the same mounds of clay where the tablets had been unearthed by earlier explorers. In the searing heat of northern Iraq, he sifted through thousands of fragments, reconstructing line by line what had once been sung in Babylonian temples. The modern world had its first encounter with Utnapishtim, the man who had survived the flood of the gods. For scholars of the time, the implications were staggering. Until then, the ancient Near East had been known only through the Bible and a few Greek historians. Suddenly, it had a voice of its own. The term Antediluvian began to lose its purely theological meaning and take on an archaeological one. It no longer referred only to a world destroyed by divine judgment, but to any world that predated recorded history, the vanished epochs whose traces could now be touched, measured, and classified. Clay replaced parchment. What Smith's discovery also revealed, unintentionally, was that myth could be historical without being literal. The flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh was not proof that the biblical story was true in detail, but that both had sprung from the same landscape of memory. In the eyes of 19th century scholars, Mesopotamia became the cradle not only of civilization, but of human imagination. The Tigris and Euphrates had nurtured the first cities, the first writing, and perhaps the first attempts to explain why the world sometimes ended. The timing of these discoveries was perfect for a century obsessed with origins. Darwin's On the Origin of Species had appeared only a decade earlier, challenging the timeline of creation. Geologists were mapping epochs that stretched millions of years beyond Genesis. The idea of a flood was no longer just a moral event. It became a geological hypothesis, a way to explain sudden changes in the fossil record or the curious distribution of marine sediments on land. The flood moved from theology into science, and the antediluvian world became a phrase bridging both realms, a poetic shorthand for everything ancient, mysterious, and partially understood. Excavation spread across the Near East like wildfire. In the ruins of Babylon, Assur, and Ur, archaeologists unearthed more cuneiform tablets, revealing vast bureaucratic archives, astronomical texts, and myths long forgotten. The romanticism of early explorers often collided with the emerging discipline of archaeology. Some were adventurers chasing fame, others true scholars seeking context. But all of them shared the same awe, that human history reached deeper than anyone had imagined. By the end of the 19th century, antediluvian had become a fashionable adjective in both science and literature. It described fossil creatures, primeval forests, or anything that felt impossibly old. To call something antediluvian was to place it before memory, before the known world. The irony, of course, was that the very term was born from myth, even as scientists used it to label their most empirical findings. The flood that had once been seen as divine punishment now served as a metaphor for time itself, eroding and reshaping the landscape of knowledge. George Smith did not live to see how far his discovery would ripple. He died young, in his 30s, while on another expedition to the Middle East. His body was buried in the same soil that had preserved the stories he loved, but his work transformed the study of antiquity. The flood of Utnapishtim opened the door to a century of comparative research between Mesopotamian, Egyptian and biblical traditions, and gave birth to the field we now call Assyriology. The antediluvian world was no longer a mythic stage but a field of study, where history and legend could be excavated side by side. The early archaeologists who followed him, Austin Henry Layard, Hormuzd Rassam, and others, continued to bring back the shattered libraries of Mesopotamia. Each tablet they found was a sentence in humanity's preface, written in clay. For the first time, the flood story could be compared across languages, revealing subtle differences in tone and purpose. It became clear that the ancients did not think of the deluge as the end of the world, but as the beginning of memory. The word antediluvian lingered in popular imagination long after scholars abandoned its biblical connotations. It appeared in Victorian novels, in debates about evolution, even in advertisements for products promising to restore youth from antediluvian times. It was a reminder that every age thinks itself modern until it uncovers something older. Looking back, what is most striking about that period is not what they discovered, but how they felt when they did. The thrill that drove men like Smith to piece together fragments of clay was not about proving or disproving religion. It was about hearing the human voice of deep time. Those tiny wedge marks pressed into wet earth 4,000 years before the Common Era were not abstractions. They were sentences written by people who feared storms, who built boats, who survived. The archaeologists of the 19th century were not just unearthing ruins, they were listening to continuity, to the sound of their own ancestors' thinking. Today, we can read the flood myths of Mesopotamia on museum glass, translated and annotated, the ore neatly catalogued. But for those first scholars, it was a revelation that humanity had always been writing to itself. Each fragment of clay whispered that civilization was older than its own memory. The antediluvian world turned out not to be a place at all, but a condition, the eternal space between what we remember and what we can still uncover. And perhaps that is why the phrase endures. It captures not just the past before the flood, but the feeling of standing at the edge of the knowledge, with a shovel in hand and a question that no God can answer. How far back does our story really go? Before the flood, the world was said to have been ruled by giants. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown, the mysterious figures whom later ages would call the Nephilim. The idea that there was once a generation of beings larger, stronger, and longer lived than us appears across civilizations, and it carries something deeper than superstition. It speaks to a universal sense that there was once a time when humans were closer to the gods, not in piety but in scale. To those who lived after, this imagined antediluvian world became the measure of everything lost. In the book of Genesis, the description of that era is brief, almost evasive. It says that there were giants on the earth in those days, when the sons of God took the daughters of men, and their offspring were mighty. The statement sits in the text like a fossilized bone, recognizable, provocative, but with little context left to explain it. Later traditions expanded on the idea. In the Hebrew imagination, the world before the flood was not just morally corrupt, but physically extraordinary, inhabited by beings of immense lifespan and stature. The line between human and divine blurred. Life stretched for centuries. Wisdom and violence grew in equal measure. The ancient Near East, where this tradition formed, was already crowded with stories of semi-divine kings and heroes whose lifespans defied belief. The Sumerian king list, an inscription dating back more than 4,000 years, names rulers who reigned for hundreds or even thousands of years before a great flood swept over the land. After the flood, lifespans drop sharply, as if time itself were shortened. This pattern, a long-lived semi-mythic age followed by a flood, and then a smaller mortal world, appears again and again across early mythologies. It was not meant as a calendar, it was a world view. Before catastrophe, humanity was part of the divine rhythm of nature. Afterward it became fragile, temporary and accountable. When early readers in the ancient world encountered these immense ages, men living 8 or 9 centuries, they did not see contradiction but meaning. Longevity symbolized nearness to origin. To live long was to remember more of creation, to carry within one's body the first spark of life uncorrupted by time. In Mesopotamian and biblical contexts alike, this distance from modern mortality was less biological than moral. The decline in lifespan represented the increasing separation between humanity and the divine, between innocence and awareness. The figure of the Nephilim crystallizes this loss into mythic anthropology, the attempt to explain not only why humans die, but why they sometimes imagine ancestors who did not. The word itself, from a Hebrew root meaning fallen, or those who cause others to fall, suggests ambiguity rather than monstrosity. These were not necessarily physical giants, but figures of power and transgression. Later interpreters in the Hellenistic and apocryphal periods expanded them into full-blown hybrids, the offspring of heavenly beings and mortal women. Texts like the Book of Enoch describe them as immense in stature, violent in spirit and doomed to perish in the flood. Yet beneath the drama lies an older anxiety, the sense that human greatness can become unbearable to the world itself. Outside the biblical tradition, the idea of long-lived or superhuman ancestors is almost universal. The Greeks remembered the age of heroes, when demigods like Heracles and Perseus walked among mortals. The Hindus spoke of earlier yugas, world ages, in which human virtue and lifespan were greater, and both declined as time moved forward. The Chinese mythic dynasties credited their founding sages with reigns lasting centuries. These stories are not records of impossible biology, but expressions of cultural nostalgia. To ancient peoples, moral decay and physical diminishment were parallel. The more corrupt humanity became, the shorter its days. The flood in that sense was both consequence and reset. When the book of Genesis lists the antediluvian patriarchs, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Methuselah, and the rest, their ages are extraordinary but precise. Adam lives 930 years, Methuselah 969. The numbers may encode symbolic patterns, perhaps related to lunar cycles or the mathematics of sexagesimal counting, inherited from Mesopotamia. But their greater meaning lies in narrative contrast. Before the flood, time expands. After it, it collapses. The flood becomes the hinge on which human time turns from the divine to the mortal. Archaeologically and anthropologically, such ages reflect something profound about how early agrarian societies perceived longevity and authority. In the earlier city-states, wisdom was often measured by age. Elders held knowledge of the land's cycles, the stars and rituals that tied the community to cosmic order. To imagine rulers living for centuries was to acknowledge that power was cumulative, built through generations of memory. The giants of early myth are not all literal beings, but cultural metaphors for founders, those whose achievements seemed beyond the reach of ordinary men. The monuments of ancient Sumer, the irrigation canals, the ziggurats, and the writing systems themselves were feats so vast that later generations could only ascribe them to superhuman figures. The notion of the Nephilim as fallen ones also mirrors ancient anxieties about knowledge. In the story of the Watchers from Enochian tradition, celestial beings descend to Earth, teach humanity forbidden arts, metallurgy, enchantment, cosmetics, and corrupt what was once pure. These teachings advance civilization even as they doom it. It is the oldest cautionary tale about progress, that every technology carries the shadow of its misuse. Whether or not the Nephilim existed in any physical sense, their legend survives because it captures that tension perfectly. Civilization is both gift and trespass. The fascination with long-lived patriarchs also speaks to a deep human discomfort with mortality. When early readers calculated that Methuselah died in the very year of the flood, they saw not coincidence but poetic justice, the longest-lived man marking the end of an age. His death closes the door on the immortal memory of creation. After him, no human would live long enough to witness the same world twice. Modern science, of course, views these lifespans as symbolic, not literal. But even within that symbolism, we glimpse the logic of early human timekeeping. The ancients did not distinguish sharply between mythic and calendrical years. They measured eras by generations, dynasties, and agricultural cycles. When a text claims that a patriarch lived 900 years, it may encode the memory of a lineage rather than an individual, the accumulated wisdom of an ancestral line distilled into one name. In that way, Methuselah may represent not a single person, but the memory of an entire people stretching back to the dawn of farming. The giants, the Nephilim, and the long-lived patriarchs occupy a liminal space between anthropology and imagination. They mark the border between history and myth, between what we can measure and what we still need to feel. To study them is to recognize that early human stories often carried truths of emotion rather than data, truths about fear, awe, and the desire to belong to something larger than a single lifetime. For the world before the flood, longevity was not merely a gift, it was a burden. In surviving too long, the ancient heroes became witnesses to humanity's corruption. Their strength and memory turned against them. In the end, they were swept away, not just because they were wicked, but because they belonged to a world that could no longer bear such vastness. The flood became nature's way of restoring scale. To read those ancient lists and legends today is to glimpse how early civilizations imagined their own origins, not as humble beginnings, but as decline from greatness. We moderns, in our obsession with progress, tell the story in reverse, but the ancients looked backward and saw perfection fading, the divine withdrawing, and human life shortening as the price of consciousness. Perhaps that is the truer paradox, that knowledge and longevity were once seen as incompatible. And so, when we hear of the giants who walked before the waters rose, we are not meant to envy them. They are warnings carved into the oldest chapters of human memory, reminders that power without limit and time without death are the very things that make gods fear their own creations. What the world feared before the flood was not extinction, but excess, that life itself could grow so vast, so loud, that even the heavens would need to silence it. When the waters receded, the flood did not disappear. It stayed behind, in memory, in language, in law. Across the ancient world, long after the clay dried and the last survivors rebuilt their homes, the deluge became something else, a moral echo. What had once been an act of destruction began to transform into a story about restraint, responsibility, and the human capacity to remember. The flood, in its afterlife, became the first great warning, not to fear the gods, but to understand ourselves. In the centuries following the composition of Genesis, the story of the flood drifted into new landscapes of belief. It was retold by prophets, reinterpreted by philosophers, and reframed by theologians as more than history. It became a mirror. The moral arc of the flood narrative bends through three traditions: Hebrew prophecy, early Christian reflection, and Islamic revelation. and in each we can see the same question forming quietly beneath the surface. If destruction once cleansed the earth, could mercy now do the same? In the Hebrew scriptures, this evolution begins with the prophets. By the time of Isaiah, perhaps in the 8th century before the Common Era, the flood had ceased to be an event and had become a metaphor. The prophet, speaking in the aftermath of war and exile, invokes the deluge not as a threat, but as a comparison to divine patience. "This is as the waters of Noah to me," God says in Isaiah's words. "For as I swore that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I will not be angry with you." The flood becomes the background against which compassion is measured. What was once a story of annihilation is transformed into a covenant of endurance, a divine refusal to repeat the past. For Isaiah's audience, that reinterpretation was more than comfort. It was survival. The people of Judah had seen their city besieged, their temple burned, their faith shaken. The flood symbolized not just divine power, but the possibility that power could change. Through this new lens, the deluge is no longer divine punishment, but divine exhaustion, the moment when even the heavens learn the limits of wrath. Humanity, once drowned for its corruption, is now preserved despite it. In that shift lies the seed of a moral revolution. Centuries later, early Christian writers inherited this transformed story and read it through the language of renewal. The second epistle of Peter, written in the late 1st or early 2nd century of the Common Era, speaks of the flood as both precedent and parable. It recalls the ancient world deluged and destroyed, but places that event in a cosmic sequence: water first, then fire. For Peter, the flood becomes not merely a historical memory but a moral cycle: creation, corruption, cleansing, and restoration. It is both a warning and a pattern. Humanity's forgetfulness, he argues, is what invites repetition. They deliberately forget, he writes, that long ago by God's word the heavens came into being and the earth was formed out of water and by water. The flood thus becomes a reminder that the moral order of the world is as fragile as the physical one. But even within this stern warning lies a curious softness. The flood's recurrence is no longer literal, it is spiritual. In Christian theology, baptism itself reimagines the flood, not as the end of life, but as its cleansing. The waters that once drowned are now the waters that renew. This inversion marks one of the most profound moral reinterpretations in ancient thought, the transformation of catastrophe into compassion. The flood, reimagined through ritual, becomes an act of divine trust, a symbolic assurance that humanity, though imperfect, is still worth beginning again. When Islam emerged in the 7th century of the Common Era, it inherited both the Mesopotamian geography and the Abrahamic memory of the flood. The Quran preserves the figure of the prophet Noah, but retells his story with new emphasis. Here, the flood is not a random act of wrath, but the inevitable consequence of rejection. Nuh preaches for centuries, warning his people of the coming deluge, yet only a few believe. The focus shifts from divine impatience to human stubbornness. In the Quranic narrative, the flood becomes less about punishment and more about choice. The waters arrive only when moral communication breaks down completely. The Quran also adds emotional depth to Nuh's role. He is not the silent builder of Genesis, but a pleading voice, weary, compassionate, and tragic. In Surah Hud, he cries out to God for his son, who refuses to board the ark. The response is gentle but firm. He is not of your family, his conduct is unrighteous. In that moment, the story ceases to be about divine destruction and becomes a meditation on human limits. The flood, once the boundary between godly and godless, now defines the line between love and obedience, grief and faith. Later, Islamic commentators continued to reinterpret this theme. The flood was read as a metaphor for ignorance washing over humanity, or as a symbol of divine truth cleansing corruption. Some mystics even saw it as an inner experience, the drowning of ego in the vast ocean of God. In every retelling, the flood recedes further from literal history and closer to psychology. It becomes the story of how consciousness survives guilt. Across these traditions, Hebrew, Christian, Islamic, the moral meaning of the flood shifts from punishment to pedagogy. Each era inherits the same image, and gives it a new tone. To the ancient world, the flood proved that divine justice existed. To later ages, it proved that mercy did too. What began as terror ends as tenderness, the same way that a storm gives way to calm. Yet even in its gentler forms, the story retains its warning. The flood continues to whisper that civilizations like coastlines are fragile. It reminds every generation that moral erosion can be as gradual as rising water. This is why the prophets and writers who inherited the myth never let it rest. They understood that the deluge is not just a past event but a recurring pattern in human behaviour. Pride rising to excess, empathy drowning in noise, then the search for dry ground all over again. What makes this evolution so remarkable is how it mirrors humanity's own development. Early myths externalized chaos. The gods unleashed it upon us. Later scriptures internalized it. We unleash it ourselves. The flood moves from heaven to conscience, from the cosmos to the heart. That shift, subtle yet profound, is what turns myth into morality. Today, when the flood story is retold, it rarely serves as divine warning. It survives as metaphor for climate, collapse, or renewal. Yet the moral echo remains intact. Each version still asks the same thing. How do we live knowing that we have survived before? The story's endurance across millennia is not about its literal truth, but its emotional accuracy. The flood is the memory of a moment when the world broke, and then began again, smaller, humbler, and more aware of its fragility. If the deluge began as punishment, it ends as reflection. It teaches that even destruction can evolve into understanding. The flood did not end humanity. It began conscience. And perhaps that is its final purpose, to remind us that survival in every sense is a moral act. The story of the flood was never really about water. It was about the moment a species realized that nature did not have to hate it in order to erase it. For thousands of years we kept that memory close, folded into myths, carved into tablets, retold around fires. Now, as coastlines retreat and storms rewrite the maps again, the story feels less like ancient imagination and more like early reporting. The Bronze Age flood was a story about limits. The modern flood is about whether we have any left. What makes a storm from 6,000 years ago still relevant in the age of satellites and carbon graphs? Maybe because the flood was the first time humanity recognized that it was small, the first time we looked at the planet not as a garden or a stage, but as something alive enough to fight back. In that sense, every flood since has been a retelling, a sequel we keep writing with higher technology and worse foresight. The myth endures not because it explains the past, but because it keeps describing the present. In the ancient world, floods were cyclical. They nourished and destroyed in equal measure. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded every year, bringing silt that made agriculture possible, and sometimes annihilating entire settlements. People learned early that survival depended on balance, on reading the rhythms of water, so they built calendars from the sky, channels from the mud, temples to keep the peace between river and rain. Civilization itself, in a way, was humanity's apology to the flood. Today, our floods no longer follow those rhythms, they follow data curves. We still worship the storm, but now the altar is digital, climate models, carbon targets, temperature anomalies plotted in rising red. The myth has evolved again, from punishment to prophecy to prediction. The gods are gone, but the uncertainty remains. The sea level graph looks suspiciously like a tablet fragment, a warning we once knew how to read but forgot to translate. It is easy to mock the ancients for their mythic explanations, but perhaps they were just more honest about their fear. They turned catastrophe into conversation. We turned it into statistics. The people who wrote the flood story didn't have laboratories, but they understood cycles and guilt. They knew that when a civilization takes too much, the world eventually takes something back. That pattern hasn't changed, only the vocabulary has. Where they said wrath of heaven, we say environmental collapse. Where they said divine silence, we say feedback loop. The meaning is identical. The earth has stopped listening. There's also a certain humour in this. The flood myths all end with a promise that it would never happen again. Yet here we are, standing on shorelines pretending not to notice the tide. Maybe we should have added a footnote to that covenant. Promise void if species forgets what water can do. If the Bronze Age storytellers could see us now, they might be impressed, not with our progress, but with our creative new ways to drown. What's fascinating is that modern science has in a way revalidated the myth, just not in the way it expected to. Geology confirms that massive floods did reshape the world at the end of the last ice age. The melting of glaciers released torrents that carved entire valleys. The Black Sea may indeed have flooded catastrophically around 7,000 years ago, swallowing coastal villages and seeding the stories that became scripture. In that sense, we are not disproving myth. We are completing its timeline. The storytellers described what they saw. We are still measuring it. Yet the real relevance of the flood story is not geological. It's psychological. The myth endures because it describes the human condition, our genius for creation, our blindness to consequence, our longing for second chances. The flood is not about what nature does to us, but what we do with what's left. Every civilization has its own version of the rising water, the moment it realizes that complexity has outgrown stability. For the Sumerians, it was deforestation and irrigation collapse. For us, it's carbon and temperature. The variables differ. The story does not. The flood narrative is also the oldest example of what we now call collective memory, a way of encoding trauma so that descendants remember without reliving it. We carry that instinct into modern storytelling. Disaster films, climate fiction, even the nightly news, all of them rehearse the same lesson. That survival is a moral skill, not just a biological one. In that sense, the flood myth is not ancient. It's ongoing. It is the species-level conversation about how to stay human when the world resets the rules. Maybe that's why we still need the flood. It forces humility. It reminds us that civilization is not the opposite of nature, but an experiment within it. It tells us that no matter how advanced our machines become, we are still participants in the planet's long, wet memory. And perhaps most importantly, it gives us a narrative that can hold both guilt and grace. The idea that even after failure there can still be renewal. Without stories like this, we might forget that starting over is possible. There's an irony that the oldest story humanity ever wrote was not about conquest or invention, but about loss. The flood narrative begins with everything going wrong, and ends with the world beginning again. It's almost comically optimistic. If you think about it, it's the first reboot story in history, a hard reset written on clay. Maybe that's why it still resonates in an age that constantly threatens itself with endings. Nuclear, ecological, digital. We've just replaced the gods with algorithms, but the plot remains the same. When climate scientists describe tipping points, they're speaking the language of Genesis without realizing it. When activists talk about stewardship, they echo the covenant of renewal. And when we watch ice shelves collapse in slow motion on screen, part of us remembers, even if unconsciously, that we've been here before, on the edge of the flood, wondering what will survive. Humour helps us cope with that memory. It's almost a defence mechanism. The flood myth has always had a faint absurdity to it. One family, one boat, every animal squeezed together like divine overpacking. It's a scene both tragic and ridiculous, which might be why it's endured so long. It allows us to laugh at the impossible while still fearing it. And maybe that's a healthier form of faith, not blind reverence, but a resigned smile at the universe's sense of proportion. The modern flood, of course, looks different. It arrives as data before it arrives as water. It comes in the form of droughts, fires, crop failures, the quiet floods of instability rather than the cinematic deluge. But the story still works, because the moral structure hasn't changed. Action, excess, consequence, renewal. We are, as ever, somewhere between chapters 3 and 4. If the ancients built altars after their flood, perhaps our version will be archives, records of temperature, photographs of coastlines, satellites orbiting like digital ravens searching for dry land. And just like them, we will likely tell our descendants that we've learned our lesson, that this time will be different. It probably won't be. But that doesn't make the story any less worth telling. The flood endures because it is not just about endings, but about remembering to begin again. It is the human operating manual for humility, version 2.0, updated every few thousand years. The gods of the past may have punished with water, but the universe we inhabit simply reacts. The myth reminds us that cause and effect are older than morality, and that wisdom often comes only after the tide. When you strip it of religion, what remains of the flood is a pattern of awareness. It says that even when everything collapses, something learns. Civilization is, in that sense, one long recovery period from the last deluge. And perhaps, if we're paying attention, it will also be the preparation for the next one. The flood never left us. It became metaphor, law, science, and dream. We keep returning to it because it's the one story large enough to contain both our fear of extinction and our faith in continuity. And maybe that's all myth was ever for, to make the unbearable seem meaningful long enough for us to adapt. So yes, we still need the flood. Not the water, but the warning. Not the ark, but the awareness. A reminder that civilization is a fragile raft built on a moving sea, and that every generation in one way or another is still trying to keep it afloat. If every flood is a story about forgetting, then perhaps the world has never stopped trying to remember. The oceans were always there before us, and they will be there long after we stop calling them by name. Maybe that is what myth has been trying to say all along, or that water never really left. It just keeps changing shape, finding new ways to remind us that everything alive is borrowed from it. You could say that the planet itself is still flooded, just in a slower way. The continents are islands in disguise, floating on a deep foundation of salt memory. The air we breathe once rose from the evaporation of ancient seas. The water in your glass once passed through the lungs of a fish that lived before trees existed. Every cell in you is a tiny ocean pretending to be stable land. In that sense, we are not survivors of the flood. We are its continuation. Water never stopped rewriting the story. It carved valleys, moved mountains, and erased empires one tide at a time. It was the first archivist, patient, slow, indifferent. Everything we build eventually returns to its language. A stone temple becomes silt. A city becomes sediment. Even our data, stored in glass and metal, will one day dissolve into minerals. And maybe that's the most honest version of eternity. Not immortality, but circulation. There's a strange comfort in that. The same element that once terrified us now sustains us. We are mostly water pretending to be thought. When you cry, sweat, or speak, it's the same molecule moving through a new form of consciousness. The flood, in that sense, was not a punishment but an introduction. A way of showing us that change is not the end of stability, but the beginning of awareness. We like to think of the flood as something that happened once and was overcome, but it never stopped raining, only slower. The flood still arrives as glacial melt, as a rising tide beneath the ice of memory, as emotions we don't have words for. It moves through us quietly, rearranging who we are. Civilization itself might just be a levee, a fragile wall we keep building to hold back what we don't want to feel. When you stand by the sea and watch the waves pull back, you're witnessing the oldest rhythm the earth knows: expansion and return. Every withdrawal is a rehearsal for coming back. Maybe that's why water has always been sacred. It erases, but it also renews. It washes bodies, but it also baptizes thought. It's both grave and womb. To step into it is to become temporary again. Even language carries that fluidity. The word remember itself comes from the act of rejoining, to put back together what was dismembered by time. The flood stories, from Sumer to scripture to science, all do the same thing. They remember the world. They gather the fragments of fear, guilt, and survival, and float them toward understanding. Myths aren't lies. They are the sediment of what we can't explain yet. We are, as ever, amphibians of consciousness. We live between two states, certainty and surrender. And the flood, in its countless retellings, has always invited us to practice that balance, to let go just enough to stay afloat. Maybe that's why people still sit by rivers when they need to think, or why so many of us find calm in the sound of rain. It's an echo of our first environment, the lullaby of evolution. There's something humbling about knowing that memory itself might be an aquatic process. Our brains float in cerebrospinal fluid. Our blood mimics the chemical ratios of seawater. To think is to ripple. Every thought is a small tide against the shore of the skull, and when we dream of floods, perhaps it isn't fear at all, but a kind of homecoming, the body remembering its origin. Water has another quality we rarely talk about: patience. It takes centuries to carve a canyon, minutes to drown a city, and milliseconds to bead on skin. It doesn't rush, it doesn't bargain, it just returns, again and again, to its lowest point, as if humility were a law of physics. And in that way it teaches a kind of moral geometry. Everything that resists will erode, everything that yields will endure. Maybe that's what the old storytellers meant when they described the flood as cleansing. Not moral cleansing in the way later religions imagined, but the simple truth that water always finds balance. It doesn't care about sin, only saturation. When there's too much of something, it redistributes. The flood was not revenge, it was correction. And maybe our modern world, swollen with noise and heat, is once again inviting correction, not from gods, but from equilibrium itself. Even if the earth floods again, it won't be the same story. We've changed the script. We have satellites, warnings and simulations, but we also have the same tendency to forget until the water touches our feet. The myth was supposed to prevent that, to remind us that what is drowned is never gone, only absorbed, that forgetting is the real deluge. If you listen closely to the ocean, it doesn't sound angry, it sounds patient. Each wave says, "You will return," not as punishment, but as participation. We began here, and we will end here, and in between we are just the brief dry chapter of something larger. The flood never ended, it just learned to breathe. When archaeologists brush silt from ancient tablets, when poets describe loss as a tide, when a scientist models the Greenland ice melt, all of them are speaking the same language. They're remembering water, trying to write down what it keeps saying, that permanence is an illusion, that every boundary is temporary, that survival is not resistance but rhythm. In the end, the flood isn't about drowning, it's about returning. Every story of deluge ends with emergence, a mountain, a rainbow, a seed sprouting from mud. That's not mythic optimism, it's biological fact. Life keeps rebuilding itself from ruin. Even the bacteria at the ocean floor recycle the remains of what falls from above. The planet is one enormous act of reassembly. Perhaps that's why we keep telling this story. It gives scale to our smallness, but also continuity to our fragility. It tells us that what comes after destruction isn't emptiness, but rearrangement. The water that covered the world is still here, now inside us, now above us, now waiting patiently below. It never left. It simply changed form, like a memory still being processed. And maybe that's the lesson. Not to fear the flood, but to understand it as a teacher. To know that forgetting is inevitable, but remembering is possible. That even as we drown in distraction, there's still something beneath, waiting to rise again. A calm, ancient voice that once spoke through rivers, and now through reflection, that to live is to stay in motion. We were born from water, carried by it, and one day we'll return to it. But for now, we float, halfway between past and possibility, listening, breathing, remembering. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the Sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.